Some recordings you wish you could delete, but the timestamp won't let you forget. My name is Marcus, and I've been working security at Hillcrest Memorial Gardens for 11 years now. Most people think watching over a cemetery at night would be the kind of job that keeps you awake with fear. But the truth is, it's usually peaceful. The dead don't cause trouble. It's the living you have to worry about. I monitor 47 cameras scattered across 200 acres of rolling hills and granite monuments. And 99% of the time, the only movement I see is wind through the oak trees or the occasional deer wandering between the headstones. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Tuesday through Saturday. I've got my routine down to a science. Coffee at 10:30. First patrol of the monitor feeds at 11. Another coffee at midnight. Then hourly checks until dawn. The office is a small building near the main entrance, just a desk, a wall of monitors, and a logbook where I record anything unusual. In 11 years, I've filled maybe 6 pages. But every Tuesday at exactly 2:47 a.m., camera 14 picks up something that doesn't belong. It started about 8 months ago. I was doing my midnight rounds when I noticed movement on screen 14, which covers rows 12 and 13. At first, I thought it might be a motion blur glitch, but when I looked closer, I could make out the clear silhouette of a person walking slowly between the headstones. I checked the timestamp. 2:47 a.m. Tuesday. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed out to investigate. But by the time I reached rows 12 and 13, there was nobody there. No footprints in the dew-wet grass. No signs anyone had been walking around. The next Tuesday, same thing. 2:47 a.m. Camera 14, same walking figure. This time I was ready. I had the radio in one hand and was already heading for the door when the movement started. I made it to the location in under 2 minutes, but again, nothing. By the 4th Tuesday, I started recording the footage. The figure always followed the same path, entering the frame from the left, walking slowly between the headstones, then stopping at plot 12J. They would stand there for exactly 43 seconds, then continue walking until they disappeared. Always the same route, always the same timing. Plot 12J bothered me even before the recordings started. It's one of the few empty plots in that section, just a small metal marker with the plot number, no headstone, no name. Most empty plots are in the newer sections, where families buy them in advance. But 12J sits right in the middle of occupied graves from the 1980s and 90s. After 6 weeks of recordings, I decided to check with the office staff. Janet, who handles our burial records, has been here since 1979 and knows every detail about every grave. When I asked her about 12J, her expression changed. She pulled out the thick binder where she keeps copies of all our burial documents. "Oh," she said quietly, "Mrs. Chen." Mrs. Chen had been scheduled for burial in plot 12J on March 15th, 2023. All arrangements had been made. The plot purchased, the headstone ordered, the service planned. But 3 days before the burial, her family had changed their minds. Some family disagreement about burial versus cremation. They had requested a full refund and taken Mrs. Chen to Garden of Peace Cemetery across town instead. I asked Janet what time Mrs. Chen's service had originally been scheduled. 2:47 p.m., she said. Why? The recordings continued every Tuesday. Always the same time, always the same figure. Always stopping at 12J. I tried adjusting camera 14, thinking maybe it was a technical malfunction, but the recordings were too clear, too consistent. The figure moved like a person, not a glitch or shadow, but someone walking with purpose. I started staying later on Tuesdays, sometimes until 4 in the morning, just to see if anything else would happen. Nothing ever did. The figure would appear, walk to 12J, stand for 43 seconds, then disappear. No other cameras picked up any movement. One Tuesday in November, I decided to position myself where I could see plot 12J directly while watching camera 14. I set up a lawn chair about 50 feet away, behind a large monument where I'd have a clear view but remain hidden. At 2:47 a.m., I watched the monitor as the figure began its usual walk. Then I looked up toward the actual plot. There was nobody there. The camera showed the figure clear as day, stopping at 12J, standing motionless. But when I looked at the plot itself, I saw only empty grass and the small metal marker. I looked back at the monitor. The figure was still there, perfectly visible on screen. Back to the plot, nothing. I watched this happen every Tuesday for 3 more months. The camera never lied, but my eyes never saw anything. I started wondering if I was losing my mind, if 11 years of night shifts had finally caught up with me. But the recordings were there, undeniable, saved in our digital system with timestamps that matched our other security footage. Last week, I found out Mrs. Chen had finally been laid to rest. Her family had resolved their differences and decided on burial after all. Janet showed me the death certificate. Mrs. Chen had died quietly in her sleep on a Tuesday night at 2:47 a.m. I haven't checked camera 14 since then. Some things are better left unrecorded. But every Tuesday at 2:47 a.m., I still hear footsteps in the gravel outside my office window. The first time I heard the humming, I thought someone had forgotten to turn off a radio. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I've been a funeral director at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 14 years. It's a family business. My grandfather started it in 1962, my father took over in the 80s, and now it's mine. Our facility has 3 viewing parlors, a chapel, and preparation rooms in the back. Most evenings, I stay late to handle paperwork or prepare for the next day's services. Peaceful Rest sits in a converted Victorian house that gives the place a warm, homey feeling that families find comforting. Parlor C is our smallest room, tucked away at the end of the main hallway. It's where we usually hold viewings for elderly clients who don't have many remaining friends or family members. The humming started on a Thursday evening in late September. I was working on funeral arrangements when I heard it drifting down the hallway, a soft, melodic sound, almost like a lullaby. I assumed Maria, our night cleaning staff, had brought a small radio to keep her company. But when I walked down to check, Maria wasn't there. All the lights were off, and Parlor C was empty. The next evening, same thing. This time, I was certain the humming was coming from Parlor C. I walked down the hallway slowly, trying not to make any noise with my heels on the hardwood floor. As I got closer, I could make out the melody more clearly. It was Brahms' lullaby, soft and gentle, the way a mother might hum to put a child to sleep. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The humming stopped immediately. The room was dark except for streetlight filtering through the heavy curtains, casting everything in a pale amber glow. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, just as Maria had left them after cleaning. By the third night, I decided to check our security footage. We have cameras in all the parlors to help families who want to review services later. I pulled up the recordings from Parlor C and fast-forwarded through them, looking for anything unusual. The footage showed empty rooms, mostly. But in the evening hours, around 7:30 p.m., something strange happened. The camera would shake slightly, as if someone had bumped into it, and then the audio would pick up that same soft humming. But the room always appeared empty. I watched this happen night after night in the recordings. The humming would start at exactly 7:30 p.m. and continue for about 15 minutes. During that time, if I looked carefully, I could see subtle changes. Flowers that had been arranged one way in the morning would be positioned differently in the evening, not disturbed, but rearranged more artfully, with more care and attention to color and height. A spray of roses that had been placed on the left side of the casket would be moved to the right, where it caught the light better. Baby's breath would be repositioned to create more delicate patterns. Lilies would be turned so their faces were angled toward the viewing chairs, as if someone wanted to make sure the mourners would see them at their most beautiful. Whoever was doing this had an artistic eye and a gentle touch. The arrangements weren't just moved, they were improved. They looked like something a loving grandmother might do, someone who understood that beauty could provide comfort during grief. I started staying later, hoping to catch whoever was coming into the parlor. One evening, I positioned myself in the hallway, where I could see the entrance to Parlor C while remaining hidden. At exactly 7:30 p.m., I heard the familiar humming begin. I peered around the corner and saw the door standing wide open, though I was certain I had closed it. The humming was definitely coming from inside the room, but when I crept closer and looked in, I saw nothing. Just empty chairs and the casket surrounded by flowers. But as I watched, one of the rose arrangements began to move. Not quickly or dramatically, just a gentle shift, as if invisible hands were adjusting the stems to create a better display. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching flowers rearrange themselves while that soft lullaby continued. The movements were so careful, so loving, that I felt no fear, only a strange sense of peace. Whatever presence was in that room meant no harm. It was simply trying to make things beautiful for the families who would come to say goodbye. After about 15 minutes, the humming faded away and the flowers settled into their new positions. The room fell silent again, but it felt different, somehow warmer, more welcoming. I walked over to examine the arrangements, and they were perfect. This continued for 3 weeks. Every evening at 7:30, the humming would begin, and the flowers would be lovingly rearranged. I stopped trying to catch whoever was doing it, and simply began to appreciate the artistry. Families would comment on how beautiful the arrangements looked, how much care had obviously gone into their creation. I would smile and accept their compliments, knowing that someone else deserved the credit. On a Tuesday evening in October, the humming stopped. I waited in my office until 8 p.m., but Parlor C remained silent. When I checked the room, the flowers hadn't been touched. They looked nice enough, but they lacked that special something that had made them extraordinary for the past 3 weeks. I later learned that Mrs. Dorothy Manning, an elderly woman who had been one of our most regular visitors, had passed away the night before. She had been coming to viewings at Peaceful Rest for over 20 years, not because she knew the deceased, but because she believed no one should have to say goodbye alone. She would sit quietly in the back, sometimes bringing small bouquets from her garden to add to the arrangements. Dorothy had never had children of her own, but she had been a kindergarten teacher for 43 years. Everyone who knew her said she had the gentlest hands and the most beautiful singing voice. The humming never returned to Parlor C, but sometimes, when I'm working late and the building feels too quiet, I find myself humming Brahms' lullaby under my breath. The flowers still look lovely, but they're never quite as perfect as they were during those 3 weeks, when someone who understood the language of beauty was arranging them with invisible, caring hands. There are things in this business that don't make sense. And then there's Room 7. My name is Douglas, and I've been an embalmer at Riverside Memorial for 22 years. I've prepared over 3,000 bodies in that time, and I know the weight of grief, not just the emotional kind, but the physical weight that seems to settle into everything when someone dies. The weight of silence in a house that used to be full of laughter. The weight of clothes that will never be worn again. The weight of a casket that holds everything a person used to be. But Room 7 taught me there's another kind of weight entirely. Riverside Memorial has 4 preparation rooms. Rooms 1 through 3 are modern, equipped with stainless steel tables, proper ventilation, and digital scales that can measure a body's weight down to the ounce. Room 7 is older, part of the original building from 1958. The funeral home director keeps talking about renovating it, but we use it mainly for storage or overflow when we're particularly busy. The first time I noticed something strange was on a Tuesday in March. We had 5 bodies come in over the weekend, a car accident, and 2 elderly folks who passed naturally. So I had to use Room 7 for Mrs. Patterson, a 93-year-old woman who died peacefully in her sleep. Her family had requested a simple service, nothing elaborate, just a basic casket and a small gathering. I weighed Mrs. Patterson when she arrived, 112 pounds. Standard procedure for our records and to ensure the casket lift could handle the load safely. I finished the preparation work around 6 p.m. and wheeled her into Room 7. where she'd stay overnight before the viewing the next day. The next morning, I came in early to move Mrs. Patterson to the viewing parlor. I always double-check the weight before transporting, and when I wheeled her onto the scale, it read 159 pounds, 47 pounds heavier than the day before. I thought maybe the scale was malfunctioning. Digital scales can be sensitive to temperature changes or electrical fluctuations. I wheeled her back to room 1 and used that scale instead. 159 pounds. Same reading. This didn't make sense. Bodies don't gain weight after death. If anything, they lose weight due to fluid loss and decomposition. I checked my notes from the previous day to make sure I hadn't made a mistake with the original weight. 112 pounds, clearly written in my handwriting. When I moved Mrs. Patterson to the funeral parlor for her viewing, I weighed her again out of curiosity. 112 pounds, back to her original weight, just like that. I mentioned it to Tom, our other embalmer, but he just shrugged and said scales could be funny sometimes. Maybe the wheels on the gurney were sticking, or maybe I hadn't zeroed the scale properly. Reasonable explanations, but they didn't sit right with me. I've been doing this long enough to know when something isn't normal. 2 weeks later, I had to use room 7 again for Mr. Kowalski, a 70-year-old man who died of a heart attack. Same routine. Weighed him when he came in, 183 pounds. Prepared him. Stored him overnight in room 7. The next morning, 230 pounds. Exactly 47 pounds heavier. This time I was ready. I documented everything, took photos of the scale readings, checked and double-checked my equipment. When I moved Mr. Kowalski to the viewing parlor, his weight dropped back to 183 pounds. I started keeping detailed records of every body that spent time in room 7. Over the next 6 months, it happened every single time. Didn't matter if it was a 90-pound elderly woman or a 200-pound middle-aged man. Every body gained exactly 47 pounds overnight in room 7, then returned to normal weight when moved elsewhere. The weight gain wasn't just numbers on a scale. You could feel it when you moved them. The gurney wheels would strain more, require more effort to push. The casket lifts would work harder, motors humming with extra effort. Whatever was adding that weight was real and physical, not just a measurement error. I tried everything I could think of to explain it. I had the scales calibrated by a professional service. I checked the humidity levels, temperature variations, even the electrical systems in case electromagnetic interference was affecting the digital readouts. Everything came back normal. I experimented with different objects to see if room 7 affected non-organic materials. I left a 50-pound bag of sand overnight. It stayed 50 pounds. A metal toolbox, a case of embalming fluid, even a practice mannequin we use for training. None of them gained weight. Only human bodies. The strangest part was how the bodies felt when you touched them during that overnight period. I started checking on them periodically, and they felt different, not heavier to lift, but denser somehow, like they were made of something more substantial than flesh and bone. The skin felt the same, the limbs moved the same way, but there was a presence to them that hadn't been there before. One night in September, I decided to stay late and observe what happened in real time. I prepared Mr. Franklin, weighed him at 168 pounds, and wheeled him into room 7 around 7 p.m. I set up a chair in the hallway where I could see into the room and settled in to wait. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Mr. Franklin lay on the preparation table, surrounded by the familiar chemical smell of formaldehyde and the quiet hum of the refrigeration unit. I checked my watch every 30 minutes, fighting off the urge to doze. Around midnight, the temperature in the hallway dropped noticeably. Not dramatically, but enough that I could see my breath misting slightly in the fluorescent light. I stood up and looked into room 7. Mr. Franklin appeared unchanged, but the air in the room seemed thicker somehow, like it was holding more than just oxygen and formaldehyde vapor. At 12:47 a.m., I heard it a sound like a deep sigh, but longer and more resonant than anything human lungs could produce. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room and then fading into silence. The lights flickered once, just briefly. And then everything was still again. I waited until morning to weigh Mr. Franklin again. 215 pounds. 47 pounds heavier, just like all the others. I never told anyone about the sigh or the temperature drop. They already thought I was getting a little too interested in the weight discrepancies. But I kept watching Room 7, kept documenting every case. The pattern never changed. 47 pounds gained overnight. Returned to normal when moved. After a year of records, I noticed something else. Every body that spent time in Room 7 looked more peaceful at their viewing than the ones prepared in other rooms. Families would comment on how restful their loved one appeared, how the lines of pain or worry seemed to have faded. It was subtle, but consistent. I started to think that maybe the extra weight wasn't something being added to the bodies, but something being added to their journey. 47 pounds of peace, maybe. 47 pounds of whatever comes after. Something that stays with them just long enough to ease their transition, then lifts away when it's time to say goodbye. I don't use Room 7 unless I have to anymore. But when I do, I'm not afraid. Whatever happens in there during those overnight hours isn't malicious or wrong. It's just something that the dead need for a little while. Something that helps them carry the weight of leaving until they're ready to let it go. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I spent a night in Room 7 myself. Would I gain 47 pounds of something I didn't know I was missing? Would I feel whatever it is that settles into the bodies overnight? But some questions are better left unanswered, and some weights are meant to be carried by the dead alone. "26 years of keeping cemetery records, and I thought I'd seen every possible filing error until I found the entry that shouldn't exist. I'm Rita, head groundskeeper and records coordinator at Willowbrook Cemetery. It's not a large operation, just 47 acres of rolling hills and old oak trees, established in 1992 when the city needed a new municipal cemetery. We've got about 800 plots, maybe 600 of them occupied. I know every grave, every headstone, every family plot like they're old friends. My job isn't just mowing grass and trimming hedges. I maintain our burial records, coordinate with funeral homes, and make sure every plot is properly documented. It's detail work that most people find boring, but I take pride in it. When someone dies, their family shouldn't have to worry about paperwork errors or missing records. They should know their loved one has a permanent place in the world. Last September, the city asked us to digitize all our burial records for their new computer system. 26 years of handwritten ledgers, death certificates, and plot assignments had to be scanned and entered into a database. I didn't mind the work it gave me, a chance to go through everything systematically and catch any inconsistencies or missing information. I was working through the ledger from 1997 when I found the entry that made me stop and read it 3 times. Plot 18D, dated April 12, 1987. The name was listed as J. Morrison, with a note that simply said, "Interment complete." 1987. 5 years before Willowbrook Cemetery was established. I checked the other entries around it to make sure I was reading the dates correctly. Everything else was from the mid-90s, when we first opened. The handwriting looked like mine, but that was impossible. I wasn't hired until 1998, and I certainly hadn't been writing in cemetery ledgers when I was 16 years old. I pulled out my plot map to check 18D. According to my records, it was an empty plot in the older section, reserved but never used. I walked out to check it physically, and sure enough, there was just a small metal marker with the plot number. No headstone, no signs of burial, just grass and the oak tree that shaded that whole section. But something felt wrong about the ground there. It was slightly sunken, the way earth settles after a burial, and the grass grew differently lusher and darker green, like it was drawing nutrients from something beneath the surface. I went back to the office and checked every piece of documentation I could find. Death certificates, burial permits, payment records. There was nothing for J. Morrison, or Plot 18D, before 1992. But that ledger entry was there in black ink, clear as day, written in handwriting that looked exactly like mine. I called the city records office to see if they had any information about burials on this land before the cemetery was established. The property had been farmland owned by the Morrison family until the city purchased it in 1991. The farmhouse had been demolished, but there were no records of any family cemetery or burial sites. Morrison, the same last name as the mysterious ledger entry. I tried to put it out of my mind and continue with the digitization work, but I kept coming back to that entry. I started having dreams about plot 18D, always the same dream. Standing at the edge of the plot, while someone underneath knocked gently on a wooden surface. Not frantic or desperate, just patient tapping, like they were letting me know they were there. After 2 weeks of losing sleep, I decided to do something that went against every protocol and regulation in the book. I called my brother-in-law Mike, who runs a small excavation company, and asked him to bring his equipment out to the cemetery on a Saturday when we were closed. I told him I suspected there might be an unmarked grave that needed to be relocated before we could sell the plot. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either. Mike didn't ask too many questions. He'd helped me with drainage issues before and trusted my judgment about cemetery maintenance. We started digging at 8 a.m. on a cloudy Saturday in October. The earth was soft and came up easily, almost like it wanted to be moved. At about 4 feet down, Mike's shovel hit something solid. We cleared away more dirt and found the corner of a wooden casket, perfectly preserved despite being underground for what should have been over 30 years. The casket was simple but well made, crafted from oak that showed no signs of rot or decay. The brass nameplate was tarnished but readable. It didn't say J. Morrison like the ledger entry. It said simply, "Waiting." Mike and I looked at each other without saying anything. In 34 years of construction and excavation work, he'd never seen anything like this. I'd certainly never encountered a casket with no name, no dates, just that one word, waiting. We carefully excavated around the entire casket and lifted it out with Mike's equipment. It was heavier than it should have been for how well preserved it looked, and it didn't feel old. The wood still had that solid weight of fresh timber, and the brass fittings gleamed once we cleaned off the dirt. There was no lock on the casket, just a simple latch that opened easily when I pressed it. Mike stepped back and let me open it alone. He said later that he had a feeling this was cemetery business, not construction business, and he didn't want to see something he wasn't supposed to see. Inside the casket was a man in his 60s, dressed in a simple black suit that looked like it could have been tailored yesterday. His hands were folded across his chest, and his face was peaceful, with no signs of decomposition. He looked like he was sleeping, like he might open his eyes and sit up if I called his name. But it was his eyes that made me step back and close the casket immediately. They were open, just slightly, and they were looking directly at me. Not the cloudy, vacant stare of the dead, but aware and patient, like he'd been waiting for someone to find him, and he was glad it was finally me. I couldn't bring myself to open the casket again. Mike and I reburied it exactly where we'd found it, filled in the hole, and replaced the grass. He never asked me what I'd seen inside, and I never told him. Some things are better kept between the living and the dead. I went back to the office and checked the ledger entry one more time. The date was still there, April 12th, 1987. But now, I noticed something I'd missed before. In the margin next to the entry, in handwriting that was definitely mine, were the words, "Found October 15th, 2023. That was today's date. I hadn't written it, but it was there in my handwriting, in the same black ink as the rest of the entry. I locked the ledger in my desk and haven't looked at it since. The digitization project is on hold indefinitely. Some records are meant to stay handwritten. Some files are meant to stay buried. And some people are meant to keep waiting until the right person finds them. Plot 18D is still empty according to our official records, and it's going to stay that way. But sometimes, when I'm walking that section in the late afternoon, when the light slants through the oak trees just right, I can see the slight depression in the earth where someone is waiting patiently below. I don't know who Jay Morrison was or why he was buried there 5 years before the cemetery existed. I don't know how my handwriting ended up in a ledger I'd never seen before, recording events that happened when I was a teenager. But I know that some waits are longer than others, and some graves hold more than just the dead. Mirrors in funeral homes see things that mirrors in houses never do, but they're not supposed to show things that aren't there. My name is James Liu, and I've been a mortician at Evergreen Funeral Home for 16 years. I specialize in restorative work, helping people look peaceful and natural for their final goodbye, repairing damage from illness or accident, giving families the comfort of seeing their loved one as they remember them. It's detail work that requires patience and skill, and I take pride in making sure every person who comes through our doors leaves looking dignified. Our main preparation room has an antique mirror that's been hanging on the north wall since the funeral home opened in 1943. It's a beautiful piece, nearly 6 feet tall, with an ornate silver frame that somehow stayed bright despite decades of exposure to embalming chemicals and fluorescent light. The previous owner, Mr. Davidson, always said the mirror was a gift from a grateful family whose patriarch he'd prepared during the war years. Though he never mentioned which family or which war, I never paid much attention to the mirror until last spring. It was just part of the room's furniture, something that reflected the overhead lights and made the space feel larger. I'd catch glimpses of myself in it while working, but mostly I focused on the task at hand. When you're trying to restore someone's appearance after a long illness or traumatic injury, you don't have time to worry about your own reflection. The first time I noticed something strange was while preparing Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who died peacefully in her sleep. I had finished the embalming process and was working on her facial reconstruction. She'd lost considerable weight during her illness, and her family wanted her to look more like the vibrant woman she'd been before she got sick. I was applying foundation when I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. I looked up, expecting to see my own reflection, and saw Mrs. Chen lying on the preparation table just as she was in reality. But in the mirror, her eyes were open. I looked back at Mrs. Chen directly. Her eyes were closed, just as I'd positioned them after completing the embalming. I looked at the mirror again, open, not just open, but alert and focused, looking directly at my reflection. I stepped closer to the table and checked Mrs. Chen's eyelids. They were properly closed and secured. No possibility they could have opened naturally. But in the mirror, those reflected eyes tracked my movement across the room. I convinced myself it was fatigue. 16-hour days during busy periods can play tricks on your mind, and I'd been working on 3 preparations that week while my colleague was out sick. I finished Mrs. Chen's restoration, covered her with a sheet, and went home early. The next day, Mrs. Chen looked perfect for her viewing. Her family was grateful for the work I'd done, and several people commented on how peaceful she appeared. I checked the mirror while cleaning up after the service, and it showed exactly what it should: an empty preparation table and my own tired reflection. 2 weeks later, I was preparing Mr. Rodriguez, a 45-year-old man who died in a car accident. The facial damage was extensive, requiring several hours of careful reconstruction work. I was concentrating intensely, using every technique I'd learned to restore his features so his family could say goodbye to the man they remember. Halfway through the work, I needed to step back and assess my progress. I glanced at the mirror to see how the reconstruction looked from a different angle and nearly dropped my tools. In the reflection, Mr. Rodriguez was sitting up on the table, watching me work. Not just his eyes open this time, but his entire torso upright, head turned toward me with an expression of calm interest. I spun around to look at the table directly. Mr. Rodriguez was lying flat, exactly as I'd positioned him, eyes closed, showing no signs of movement. When I looked back at the mirror, the reflection showed him lying flat as well, but now his head was turned slightly toward me, and those reflected eyes were open and focused. This couldn't be fatigue or stress. This was something else entirely. I started paying closer attention to the mirror during every preparation. The pattern was always the same. The deceased would appear exactly as they were in reality, except for their eyes. In the mirror, they were always watching me, not in a threatening way, but with a kind of patient attention, like they were observing my work and approving of the care I was taking with their final appearance. Over the next few months, I documented every instance. It happened with every body, regardless of age, gender, or cause of death. The elderly woman who died in her garden, the young man who overdosed on heroin, the middle-aged teacher who lost her battle with cancer. All of them appeared in the mirror with their eyes open, watching me work. I tried covering the mirror during preparations, but that felt wrong somehow, like I was denying them something they needed. The watching didn't feel malevolent or disturbing. It felt like supervision from people who wanted to make sure their final presentation would honor their memory. I researched the mirror's history, but Mr. Davidson had died years before I started working at Evergreen, and his records were incomplete. The current owner, Mrs. Patterson, knew it was antique, but had no documentation about its origin. I contacted local antique dealers and even a few paranormal investigators, but nobody could tell me anything useful about mirrors that showed things that weren't there. One evening in November, I was working late on a particularly challenging restoration when I decided to address the mirror directly. I was preparing Miss Williams, a 92-year-old woman who'd been like a grandmother to half the neighborhood. She'd requested a viewing so people could say goodbye, but age and illness had changed her appearance significantly. I was struggling with the final details when I looked up at the mirror and saw Miss Williams sitting up, watching me with kind, open eyes. Instead of looking away, I spoke to her reflection. "I want to get this right for you," I said. "Your family needs to see you the way they remember you." The reflection nodded, just slightly, and then looked down at her own body on the table. When I followed her gaze in the mirror, I could see what I'd been missing. The left side of her mouth needed to be raised just a fraction, and her hair should be parted differently to match the style she'd worn for 60 years. I made the adjustments, and when I looked back at the mirror, Ms. Williams' reflection smiled and closed her eyes. When I looked at her directly on the table, she looked perfect. Her family said later that she looked exactly like herself, just peaceful and free from pain. After that, I started working with the mirror instead of trying to ignore it. I would make eye contact with the reflections, ask for their patience while I worked, and look to them for guidance when I wasn't sure about a detail. The work became easier, more intuitive. I was no longer just applying techniques I'd learned, I was collaborating with the people themselves to create the final image they wanted to leave behind. 6 months ago, the mirror cracked. Not dramatically, just a small line that appeared overnight, running from the upper right corner down toward the center. Mrs. Patterson offered to have it repaired, but I asked her to leave it. The crack doesn't interfere with the reflections, and somehow it feels appropriate. Even mirrors need to show the wear of all they've witnessed. I still see the watching eyes in every reflection, but they feel like old friends now. Colleagues who understand the importance of the work we do together. They've taught me that death doesn't end awareness immediately. It just changes the way people can communicate. They can't speak or move, but they can watch and guide and make sure their final appearance honors the life they lived. The mirror hangs in the same place it's been for 80 years, reflecting light and shadow and the delicate work of helping people transition from life to memory. And sometimes, when I catch a glimpse of my own reflection while working, I see the ghosts of everyone I've prepared watching over my shoulder, nodding their approval as I help another soul look peaceful for their last goodbye. I know that someday I'll be reflected in that mirror myself, lying on the preparation table, while someone else works to restore my appearance for my own final viewing. And when that day comes, I hope I'll be able to guide their hands the way so many others have guided mine. Until then, I'll keep working with my silent colleagues, learning from their watching eyes, and making sure everyone who passes through our doors leaves looking like themselves at their very best. Some visitors come for the living, and some come for reasons we can't understand. My name is Carol, and I've been the reception manager at Maplewood Cemetery for 19 years. Most people think working at a cemetery would be depressing, but it's actually quite peaceful. Families come to remember their loved ones, to bring flowers, or just sit quietly by a graveside. My job is to help them find the right plot, provide maps when needed, and maintain our visitor log for security purposes. Maplewood has been serving our community since 1897, with over 4,000 graves spread across 53 acres of rolling hills and mature oak trees. We have 3 main sections: the original historic area with elaborate Victorian monuments, the mid-century section with simpler headstones, and the modern memorial garden with flat bronze markers. Our office sits near the main entrance, a small stone building with large windows that let me keep an eye on foot traffic throughout the grounds. Visiting hours are sunrise to sunset, 7 days a week. Most people come on weekends or holidays, but we get a steady stream of visitors throughout the week. I keep a simple logbook where people can sign in if they want to. It's not required, but many families appreciate having a record of who came to visit their loved one. Every Sunday at exactly 4 p.m., Dorothy Manning signs our visitor log and asks to see her boy in the blue room. This started about 8 months ago. She's an elderly woman, probably in her 80s, always dressed neatly in a navy coat and carrying a small bouquet of flowers. She moves slowly but with purpose, and she has the kind of gentle voice that makes you want to help her with whatever she needs. The first time she came in, I assumed she was looking for a specific mausoleum or family crypt. "Good afternoon, dear," she said, approaching my desk with a warm smile. "I'm here to see my boy in the blue room. Could you direct me, please?" I checked our records for any structure that might be called a blue room. We have several mausoleums and a few family crypts, but nothing that matched that description. I asked for her son's name and looked through our burial records, but we had no one named Manning buried at Maplewood. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Manning," I said. "I don't see any record of your son here. Are you sure you have the right cemetery? There's Hillcrest Memorial about 3 miles east, and Evergreen Gardens downtown." She looked confused for a moment, then smiled again. "Oh no, dear. He's definitely here. In the blue room. He's been waiting for me." I offered to walk with her through the grounds to see if she could find the right location, thinking maybe she was remembering a landmark or architectural detail differently. We spent nearly an hour walking through all 3 sections, but she couldn't identify any specific grave or monument. She kept looking around with a puzzled expression, as if something that should have been there was missing. "That's strange," she said, as we returned to the office. "Perhaps I have the visiting times wrong. I'll come back next week." She signed the visitor log, "Dorothy Manning, visiting son in blue room," and left quietly, still carrying her bouquet of flowers. The next Sunday, same thing. 4 p.m. exactly. Navy coat, small bouquet, asking for the blue room. I explained again that we didn't have such a location, but she was polite and patient, as if she were dealing with a new employee who simply hadn't learned all the cemetery's features yet. By the 4th visit, I decided to check with Harold, our head groundskeeper who's been at Maplewood for 37 years. If anyone would know about a blue room or a Manning family plot, it would be him. Harold checked his records and walked the grounds with me, but confirmed what I already knew. No blue room, no Manning family plots, no burial records that matched Dorothy's description. He suggested she might be showing early signs of dementia and getting confused about locations. "Happens more than you'd think," he said. "People remember their loved ones being buried somewhere, but the details get mixed up over time. Maybe her son is buried somewhere else, or maybe the blue room is at a different cemetery." That made sense, but it didn't explain how Dorothy always seemed to know exactly where she was going once she left my office. I started watching her through the window after our conversations, and she never appeared lost or confused. She would walk straight to the oldest section of the cemetery and disappear among the Victorian monuments for exactly 1 hour, then walk back to the parking lot at 5 p.m. I began following her at a distance to see where she went. She would walk directly to the same spot every time, a small area near the back of the historic section where several old monuments created a kind of natural alcove. She would stand there for the full hour, sometimes talking quietly to someone I couldn't see, sometimes just standing in silence with her flowers. There was no grave in that spot, just empty grass between the larger monuments, shaded by an old oak tree that had probably been there longer than the cemetery itself. But Dorothy would stand there with the same concentrated attention that other visitors showed at their family graves. After 2 months of Sunday visits, I decided to research the Manning name in our historical records. Our office keeps archives going back to the cemetery's founding, including burial records, plot deeds, and correspondence. If there had ever been a Manning buried at Maplewood, there would be some documentation. I found nothing until I reached the records from 1958. There was a letter from Dorothy Manning requesting information about purchasing a plot for her son, who was serving overseas in the military. The letter was heartbreaking. She explained that her son was missing in action, but she wanted to be prepared to bring him home if and when his remains were recovered. The cemetery had responded with plot options and pricing, but there was no follow-up correspondence. No plot purchase, no burial arrangements, no further contact from Dorothy Manning. I checked military records at the local library and found information about Private Robert Manning, reported missing in action in Korea in 1958. His remains were never recovered, and he was never declared dead. His mother, Dorothy Manning, had moved away from our town sometime in the early 1960s with no forwarding address. The Dorothy Manning visiting our cemetery every Sunday was the right age to be the same woman, but that would make her nearly 90 years old and somehow still living in the area after being gone for over 60 years. I started paying closer attention to her visits. She always arrived in a blue sedan that looked like it was from the 1960s. Though it was in perfect condition, she never seemed to age or change, always the same navy coat, the same gentle voice, the same small bouquet of flowers. And she always asked for the blue room, as if it were a real place that I should know about. One Sunday in December, I decided to ask her directly about her son. "Mrs. Manning," I said as she signed the visitor log, "I've been looking through our records, and I found some correspondence from 1958 about your son Robert. I'm so sorry for your loss." She looked up at me with those kind eyes and smiled. "Oh, Robert isn't lost, dear. He's waiting for me in the blue room. He's been so patient, but I know he wants to come home." Mrs. Manning, our records show that Robert was declared missing in action in Korea. His remains were never recovered. She nodded sadly. "That's why I come every Sunday, to let him know I haven't forgotten him, and to bring him flowers until it's time for him to come home with me." I followed her that day, staying closer than usual because something felt different about her visit. She walked to the same spot in the historic section, but instead of standing there alone, I could see her having a conversation with someone. She was smiling and laughing, occasionally reaching out as if to touch someone's face. "I know you've been waiting such a long time," I heard her say, "but I think it's almost time now. Just a little longer, and then we can go home together." When she finished her visit and walked back toward the parking lot, I remained in the alcove where she'd been standing. The air felt different there, not cold, but somehow thinner, like it was holding space for something that wasn't quite ready to manifest. I looked up at the oak tree above me and noticed something I'd never seen before. Carved into the bark, almost too high to read, were the words "Blue Room" in letters that looked decades old. Dorothy Manning stopped coming to the cemetery in January. I called the phone number from her original 1958 letter, but it was disconnected. I checked with local nursing homes and hospitals, but found no record of anyone by that name. 2 weeks later, Harold found something while doing routine maintenance in the historic section. Buried under decades of fallen leaves in the alcove where Dorothy used to visit, he discovered a small military grave mark. It was made of bronze, weathered, but still readable. "Robert Manning, Private First Class, missing in action, Korea, 1958. We never installed that marker. It's not in any of our burial records or maintenance logs, but it was there, positioned exactly where Dorothy used to stand every Sunday, as if someone had finally brought her boy home. I still keep the visitor log on my desk, and sometimes I flip back to read Dorothy's entries. Every one of them says the same thing. Dorothy Manning, visiting son, in blue room. Last Sunday, exactly 1 year after her visits began, I was working late when I saw a blue sedan pull into the parking lot at 4 p.m. Dorothy got out, carrying her usual small bouquet. But this time, she wasn't alone. A young man in a military uniform walked beside her, and together they headed toward the historic section. I watched them through my office window until they disappeared among the monuments. They never came back to the parking lot, and when I walked out to check, the blue sedan was gone. But the alcove under the oak tree felt different now, not thin and waiting, but complete and peaceful, like something that had been broken for 65 years had finally been made whole. 23 years of driving for the dead, and you learn that some journeys change people in ways you can't explain. My name is Kevin, and I'm a transport driver for Mercy Medical Services. I pick up deceased individuals from hospitals, nursing homes, and private residences, and deliver them to funeral homes throughout the Tri-County area. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and it pays better than most people think. I drive a specially equipped van with a hydraulic lift and climate control, making sure every person reaches their final destination with dignity and care. Most people assume this job would be depressing or scary, but the truth is, it's usually peaceful. The people I transport are beyond suffering, beyond worry, beyond all the things that make life difficult. My job is simply to get them where they need to go safely and respectfully. I've moved over 4,000 people in my career, and I take pride in treating each one like they were my own family member. The route includes 12 hospitals, 16 nursing facilities, and occasional private residences when someone dies at home. Mercy General is one of my regular stops, a 400-bed hospital that serves the eastern part of our county. I probably pick up someone from Mercy General twice a week, usually elderly patients who died peacefully, or accident victims who didn't make it through surgery. Room 314 at Mercy General is where this story begins, though it took me 6 months to realize there was a pattern. The first time I noticed something unusual was when I picked up Mr. Kowalski, a 72-year-old man who died of complications from pneumonia. The hospital staff had positioned his hands at his sides, which is standard procedure. They fold a sheet over the body, place it on a gurney, and wheel it down to the loading dock where I meet them. When I delivered Mr. Kowalski to Hartman Funeral Home, the director, Mrs. Peterson, called me aside. "Kevin, did you reposition his hands during transport?" she asked. "No, ma'am. I never touch the deceased unless there's an emergency." "Why?" "His hands are folded across his chest, in a prayer position. The hospital staff always leaves them at the sides for transport." I assured her I hadn't moved anything, and we both assumed someone at the hospital had positioned him differently than usual. It didn't seem important enough to worry about. 3 weeks later, I picked up Mrs. Chen from room 314. Same procedure. Hospital staff had her hands positioned at her sides, sheet folded properly. Standard transport protocol. When I delivered her to Peaceful Rest Funeral Home, they asked the same question. "Did you adjust her hand position during the drive?" Again, I hadn't touched anything. Again, her hands had somehow moved into a prayer position during the 30-minute drive from hospital to funeral home. By the fourth occurrence, I started paying closer attention. Every time I picked up someone from room 314 at Mercy General, their hands would be repositioned into prayer during transport, even though I never left the driver's seat and the back of the van was secured and climate controlled. I mentioned it to Linda, the night supervisor at Mercy General, thinking maybe they had changed their procedure for that particular room. "Room 314? She said, looking puzzled. "We don't do anything different there. Hands always go to the sides for transport, same as every other room." I asked if there was anything special about room 314, any history or unusual circumstances that might explain what was happening. Linda checked the records, and said it was just a regular patient room, mostly used for elderly patients receiving end-of-life care. Though I will say, she added, people seem to die more peacefully in that room than in others. Family members always comment on how serene their loved one looks. Over the next few months, I kept detailed notes about every pickup, from room 314, 7 different people, all found with their hands repositioned into prayer by the time I reached the funeral home. It happened every single time, no exceptions. I tried everything I could think of to figure out how it was happening. I installed a small camera in the back of the van to record transport. I checked the van for vibrations or movement that might cause hands to shift naturally. I even had a mechanic examine the hydraulic system to make sure there were no jolts or bumps that could move a body during transport. The camera footage showed the same thing every time. Hands positioned at the sides when I loaded the gurney, hands folded in prayer when I unloaded it, but there was never any visible movement in between. The repositioning happened gradually over the course of the 30-minute drive, but so slowly and smoothly that the camera couldn't detect the actual motion. I started timing the change more precisely. The hands would begin moving about 5 minutes after leaving the hospital, and they would be fully repositioned into prayer about 5 minutes before arriving at the funeral home. Always the same timing, regardless of traffic or route variations. Dr. Martinez at Mercy General was curious about my observations and agreed to help me investigate. He arranged for me to pick up the next patient from room 314 while he followed in his car, then observed the repositioning at the funeral home. Mr. Franklin was a 68-year-old man who died peacefully after a long battle with cancer. Dr. Martinez personally positioned his hands at his sides and watched me load the gurney into my van. He then followed me to Hartman Funeral Home and helped unload the gurney. Mr. Franklin's hands were folded in perfect prayer position across his chest. "That's impossible," Dr. Martinez said. "I positioned those hands myself, and I've been watching your van the entire drive. You never stopped, never opened the back doors." We reviewed my camera footage together, and Dr. Martinez was as baffled as I was. The repositioning was clearly happening, but there was no visible cause or mechanism. "Kevin," he said, "I've been practicing medicine for 28 years, and I've never seen anything like this. But I can tell you one thing. Every patient who dies in room 314 dies peacefully, more so than in any other room in the hospital. Whatever's happening during your transport, it might be connected to whatever makes that room special." I decided to research the history of room 314. Hospital records showed it had been a patient room since Mercy General opened in 1974, with no unusual incidents or complaints. But when I dug deeper into the hospital's history, I found something interesting. Before Mercy General was built, the land had been occupied by St. Mary's Convent, a small religious community that ran a hospice for terminally ill patients. From 1923 until 1972, the hospice had been known throughout the region for the peaceful deaths of its patients and the exceptional care provided by the nuns. Room 314 at Mercy General sits on the exact location where the convent's chapel used to be. I shared this information with Dr. Martinez, and he arranged for me to speak with Sister Catherine, one of the last surviving nuns from St. Mary's Convent. She was 91 years old and living in a retirement community about an hour away, but her memory was sharp and clear. "Oh yes," she said when I described what was happening during my transports. "The chapel always had a special feeling. We used to say that people who died there were being prepared for their journey by hands more gentle than ours." She explained that many patients who died in the convent chapel would be found with their hands positioned in prayer, even if they hadn't been conscious or able to move them deliberately. We believed it was a sign that they were ready, that they had found peace and were prepared to meet their Creator. It was one of the many blessings of that sacred space. Sister Catherine smiled when I told her about the current manifestation in room 314. "It doesn't surprise me at all," she said. "Sacred ground remains sacred, even when buildings change. If people are still finding peace in that space, then the prayers of all the sisters who served there are still being answered." I continued my regular pickup schedule from room 314, but now I understood what was happening during those 30-minute drives. The people I transported weren't just moving from hospital to funeral home. They were passing through a space where decades of prayer and peaceful death had sanctified the very ground. 3 funeral homes asked me to stop picking up from room 314, not because anything was wrong with the deceased, but because the repositioned hands were making their preparation work more complicated. They would have to reposition everything to match their standard procedures. I refused to change my route. Whatever was happening during those transports was important, more important than funeral home convenience. The families of the deceased always commented on how peaceful their loved one appeared, how the worry lines seemed to have faded, how they looked ready for whatever comes after this life. Last month, Dr. Martinez called to tell me that room 314 would be converted to storage space as part of a hospital renovation. The patient beds would be moved to a new wing, and that particular room would no longer house dying patients. I picked up my last patient from room 314 on a Tuesday evening in October. Mrs. Williams, an 87-year-old grandmother who died, surrounded by family. As always, her hands were positioned at her sides when I loaded her into the van. During the drive to the funeral home, I found myself praying for the first time in years. Not for Mrs. Williams, she was clearly at peace, but for all the future patients who would die at Mercy General without the benefit of whatever presence had been watching over room 314. When I arrived at the funeral home, Mrs. Williams' hands were folded in prayer, just like all the others. But this time, there was something else. Placed gently on her chest, just above her folded hands, was a single white rose. It wasn't there when I loaded her at the hospital, and I certainly didn't put it there. The funeral director was as puzzled as I was, but Mrs. Williams' family said it was perfect. White roses had been her favorite flower, and she'd grown them in her garden for over 50 years. I don't know if the presence that watched over room 314 moved to the new patient wing, or if it remained in the storage room that used to be sacred ground. But I hope that wherever people are dying at Mercy General, they're still finding the peace that comes from gentle hands preparing them for their final journey. Some roads lead to destinations we can see, and some lead to places that exist beyond our understanding. I'm grateful to have been the driver for people traveling both kinds of routes. In 60 years of tending graves, you learn that some people never really stop saying goodbye. My name is Susan Hill, and I'm the head caretaker at Rosewood Cemetery. I've been working here since I was 16 years old, starting as a groundskeeper's assistant and working my way up to managing all aspects of cemetery maintenance. Rosewood covers 32 acres of gently rolling hills, dotted with oak and maple trees, serving our community since 1907. We have over 2,000 graves, and I know the story behind most of them. The job isn't just mowing grass and trimming hedges. I coordinate with funeral homes for new burials, maintain the graves and monuments, and help families who come to visit their loved ones. It's detail work that requires patience and respect. Every grave represents someone's final resting place, and every family deserves to find their loved one's plot looking cared for and dignified. Most graves receive visitors regularly, especially in the first few years after burial. Family members come to bring flowers, clean the headstone, or just sit quietly and remember. Over time, the visits become less frequent as people move away or pass on themselves. Eventually, some graves go decades without anyone coming to pay respects, and those are the ones that break my heart a little. Everyone deserves to be remembered. Grave 7B has been visited every single day for 37 years, and I didn't realize it until I installed security cameras last spring. The grave belongs to Margaret Rose Henley, who died in 1987 at the age of 24. The headstone is simple, just her name, dates, and a carved rose beneath the inscription, "Beloved Daughter." According to our records, Margaret was buried by her parents, but both of them died in the 1990s. She had no siblings, never married, and left no children. As far as I know, There are no living relatives to visit her grave. Yet every morning for the past 37 years, I've found fresh flowers on Margaret's grave. At first, I assumed someone was placing them there during regular visiting hours, and I just happened to miss seeing who it was. People often visit at dawn or dusk when the cemetery is quieter, and I can't be everywhere at once. The flowers were always simple, a small bouquet of seasonal blooms. Nothing elaborate or expensive, but always fresh and arranged with obvious care. I started paying more attention to grave 7B, checking it throughout the day to see if I could catch whoever was leaving the flowers. But I never saw anyone there during normal hours, and the flowers were always present when I arrived for work at 7 a.m. Whoever was visiting Margaret was coming very early in the morning or sometime after I left in the evening. The mystery nagged at me enough that I decided to install a basic security system. Not because I suspected vandalism. Rosewood is a peaceful place with very little trouble, but because I was curious about our mysterious flower bringer and wanted to make sure they weren't having any safety issues visiting the cemetery in the dark. I placed cameras at the main entrance and at key locations throughout the grounds, including one with a clear view of Section 7, where Margaret's grave is located. The system records continuously and stores footage for 30 days, so I could review any activity during the early morning hours. The first week of footage revealed the answer to my 37-year mystery, but it raised questions I didn't know how to handle. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., a woman approaches Margaret's grave, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. She walks slowly, but purposefully, as if she's made this journey many times before. She kneels beside the headstone, removes the previous day's flowers, and carefully arranges the new one. She stays for about 10 minutes, sometimes talking quietly to the grave, sometimes just sitting in silence. The strange part isn't that someone visits Margaret every night. The strange part is how the visitor is dressed and the fact that she never appears on the entrance cameras. The woman wears clothing from the 1960s, a simple dress with a cardigan sweater, low-heeled shoes, and her hair styled in a way that looks distinctly vintage. She appears to be in her 50s, with the careful posture and movements of someone who's probably dealt with arthritis for years. But if she's been visiting Margaret's grave since 1987, she would be much older now, and her clothing style should have changed over 37 years. More puzzling, the woman only appears on the camera that watches Section 7. She's never captured on the entrance cameras or any other camera in the cemetery. She simply appears walking toward Margaret's grave at 3 a.m. and disappears after placing the flowers, as if she materializes from the cemetery itself, rather than entering from outside. I reviewed footage from multiple nights, and the pattern never changes. 3 a.m., same woman, same clothing, same ritual. The timestamp on the recordings is accurate. I checked it against other cameras and confirmed the system is working properly. But somehow, this woman visits Margaret's grave every night without ever appearing on any camera except the one directly observing the gravesite. I decided to stay late one night to see if I could observe the visit in person. I positioned myself near Section 7 around 2:30 a.m., hidden behind a large oak tree where I could see Margaret's grave without being obvious. The October night was cold and still, with just enough moonlight to make out the shapes of headstones and monuments. At exactly 3 a.m., I saw her approaching from the direction of Section 9, walking along the gravel path that winds between the graves. She moved with quiet familiarity, like someone who could navigate the cemetery blindfolded. I could see her clearly middle-aged, wearing a navy dress and cream-colored cardigan, carrying a small bouquet of chrysanthemums. I watched her kneel beside Margaret's grave and begin her nightly ritual. She removed the previous flowers and arranged the new ones with obvious care, adjusting them several times until they looked perfect. Then she sat back on her heels and began talking quietly to the headstone. I couldn't make out most of what she was saying, but I caught a few phrases. "Such a beautiful day today. Mrs. Chen from the market asked about you. Your father would be so proud." She spoke with the warm, familiar tone of someone talking to a family member, full of the small details and updates that people share when they're maintaining a connection across time and distance. After about 10 minutes, she stood up, brushed off her dress, and walked back toward Section 9. I waited for her to disappear among the monuments, then followed the path she'd taken to see where she went. There was no one there. The path was empty, and there were no other exit points from the cemetery in that direction. I walked the entire perimeter of Section 9, checking behind every large monument where someone might hide. But I was alone in the cemetery. When I checked the security footage the next morning, there she was on the Section 7 camera, just as always. But when I reviewed the footage from the cameras that should have captured her walking to and from Margaret's grave, she wasn't there. The paths were empty before 3 a.m. and empty after 3:15 a.m. I researched Margaret Henley's history to see if I could identify the mysterious visitor. Margaret had worked as a secretary at the county courthouse until her death from leukemia in 1987. She lived with her parents in a small house about 2 miles from the cemetery. According to newspaper obituaries, she was described as a quiet, kind young woman who loved flowers and brought joy to everyone who knew her. The obituary mentioned that Margaret was especially close to her aunt, Dorothy Henley, who had helped care for her during her illness. Dorothy had never married and had devoted herself to taking care of her brother's family after his wife died young. The obituary said Dorothy promises to tend Margaret's memory as lovingly as she tended Margaret herself. I found Dorothy's death certificate in the county records. She died in 1992, 5 years after Margaret. At the age of 68, she was buried in a cemetery across town, not at Rosewood. But the description of her in Margaret's obituary matched the woman I'd seen on the security footage, middle-aged, devoted to her niece, and the type of person who would make a promise and keep it no matter what. I started thinking of the nightly visitor as Dorothy, though I had no way to confirm it. The idea that Margaret's aunt was somehow still fulfilling her promise to tend Margaret's memory brought me comfort rather than fear. The visits were clearly made with love and dedication, and they ensured that Margaret's grave always looked beautiful. Other staff members started noticing the nightly flower arrangements. Joe, our part-time groundskeeper, commented that Margaret's grave always had the freshest flowers in the cemetery, and he wondered who the devoted family member was. I didn't tell him about the security footage or my late-night observation. Some mysteries are better left unexplained. The visits continued throughout the fall and winter. Even during snowstorms or freezing rain, fresh flowers would appear on Margaret's grave every morning. The arrangements adapted to the season: autumn mums in October, holly and evergreen sprigs in December, hardy winter flowers during the coldest months. Last spring, I noticed a change in the pattern. The flowers were still appearing daily, but they were smaller arrangements, and the woman on the security footage moved more slowly, as if she was getting tired. One night in May, she sat beside Margaret's grave for nearly 30 minutes instead of her usual 10, and I could see her shoulders shaking as if she was crying. The next week, the flowers stopped appearing. I checked the security footage, but there were no visits at 3 a.m. Margaret's grave looked oddly empty without its daily bouquet, like something essential was missing. I waited a few days, thinking maybe the pattern had changed, but the visits had ended completely. I decided to place flowers on Margaret's grave myself, choosing the same types of seasonal blooms that had appeared there for so many years. It felt like the right thing to do, a way to honor both Margaret and the devoted visitor who had tended her memory for 37 years. As I knelt beside the grave to arrange the flowers, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Carved into the back of Margaret's headstone, in letters so small they were almost invisible, was an inscription: "Until we meet again. Love, Aunt Dorothy." The carving looked old, weathered by decades of seasons, but I'd never noticed it in all my years of maintaining this section. I ran my fingers over the letters, and they felt warm despite the cool morning air. I continued to place fresh flowers on Margaret's grave every few days, and I've taught Joe and our other staff members about the importance of keeping this particular grave looking beautiful. I don't know if Dorothy has finally found peace, or if she's moved on to wherever people go when their earthly promises are fulfilled. But sometimes, when I'm working in Section 7 early in the morning, I catch a glimpse of movement near Margaret's grave. Just a brief impression of someone kneeling among the flowers, tending them with the same loving care that had been given for 37 years. Some promises last longer than the people who make them, and some love transcends the boundaries between this world and whatever comes next. I'm honored to help maintain that connection, to ensure that Margaret Rose Henley continues to receive the devotion her aunt promised her so many years ago. Some rooms hold more than just bodies, they hold the memory of winter that never ended. My name is Tony, and I'm an assistant embalmer at Highland Funeral Home. I've been learning the trade for 3 years now under Michael Rodriguez, who's one of the most skilled embalmers in the county. It's precise work that requires steady hands, attention to detail, and respect for the people we're preparing for their final farewell. Most people think it would be a depressing job, but there's actually something peaceful about helping families see their loved one looking comfortable and at rest. Highland Funeral Home has been serving our community since 1956. The building is a converted Victorian mansion with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and the kind of solid construction that was built to last. We have 2 main preparation rooms. Room 3 is modern with all the latest equipment, and Room 4 is the original preparation space from when the funeral home first opened. Room 4 is where this story takes place, though it took me months to understand what was happening there. The first thing you notice about Room 4 is the temperature gauge. It's an old analog thermometer mounted on the wall near the main workstation, and it always reads exactly 72 degrees. The gauge looks original to the building, a brass-framed instrument with a white face and black numbers that's probably been hanging in that same spot for 67 years. The problem is that Room 4 doesn't feel like 72 degrees. It feels like a walk-in freezer. I first noticed it during my second week at Highland. Michael had assigned me to assist with preparing Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who died peacefully in her sleep. We wheeled her into Room 4, and within 10 minutes, I was shivering uncontrollably. Not just cool, but bone-deep cold that made my teeth chatter and my hands shake. "Is the heating broken in here?" I asked Michael, who was setting up the embalming equipment. He looked at me with a slight smile. "Check the thermometer. 72 degrees. I walked over and tapped the glass, thinking maybe it was stuck, but the needle was steady, and the gauge appeared to be working normally. "But it's freezing in here," I said. "Yeah, Room 4 runs cold. You'll get used to it." Michael worked with his usual calm efficiency, seemingly unaffected by the temperature, though I noticed he was wearing a heavy sweater under his lab coat. I tried to focus on learning the procedures, but the cold was so intense that I had trouble holding my instruments steady. After 20 minutes in Room 4, I had to excuse myself to warm up in the hallway. The temperature difference was shocking. Stepping out of Room 4 felt like walking from a freezer into a sauna, even though the hallway was just normal room temperature. "How long does it take to get used to the cold?" I asked Michael when he finished with Mrs. Patterson. "You don't really get used to it," he said. "You just learn to work faster." Over the next few months, I discovered that everyone who worked in Room 4 experienced the same thing. The temperature gauge always read 72 degrees, but anyone who spent more than 15 minutes in there would start shivering uncontrollably. We kept extra sweaters and jackets hanging by the door, and most of the staff avoided using Room 4 unless absolutely necessary. The strange thing was that the deceased stored in Room 4 maintained perfect preservation without any refrigeration. Bodies that should have shown signs of decomposition after 24 hours looked as fresh as they had when first brought in. The cold, whatever was causing it, seemed to act as a natural preservation system. I started paying closer attention to other details in Room 4. The air always felt thick and heavy, like breathing through a wet cloth. Occasionally, I would see what looked like breath misting from my mouth and nose, even though the thermometer insisted the room was comfortably warm. Once, I could have sworn I saw similar misting rising from a deceased patient's nostrils, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Michael had been working at Highland for 15 years and knew the history of Room 4 better than anyone. I asked him if there had always been temperature problems in that room. "It's not a problem with the heating system," he said. "We've had 3 different HVAC companies check it over the years. The heating works fine, the room should be warm, but it's been cold since the day I started working here, and probably long before that." He told me that room 4 had originally been the master bedroom of the Victorian mansion, back when it was a private residence. The funeral home had converted it to a preparation room when they bought the building in 1956. But they'd kept most of the original features: the hardwood floors, the tall windows, and the fireplace that was now sealed off. "The previous owner died in that room," Michael said. "Natural causes? Nothing dramatic. But she was found during a winter storm, and the power had been out for days. When they discovered her body, the room was below freezing, and she was perfectly preserved." The previous owner was Eleanor Whitman, an elderly widow who'd lived alone in the mansion for 23 years after her husband died. She was found in January 1956 after neighbors noticed that snow had been accumulating on her porch for several days without any sign of activity in the house. Eleanor had died peacefully in her sleep during a blizzard that knocked out power throughout the county. The house had no heat for 3 days before her body was discovered, and the bedroom where she died had been as cold as an ice ball. Despite the freezing conditions, neighbors commented that Eleanor looked remarkably peaceful, as if the cold had preserved not just her body, but the serene expression on her face. I researched Eleanor's death in old newspaper archives and found that she'd been known throughout the community for her kindness to people who were sick or dying. She had served as an unofficial hospice volunteer, sitting with terminally ill neighbors during their final days, and helping families prepare for funerals when they couldn't afford professional services. According to the articles, Eleanor believed that cold could be a blessing for the dying, that it numbed pain and eased the transition from life to death. She had often told people that she hoped to die during winter, when the cold could help her slip away peacefully, like falling asleep in the snow. The more I learned about Eleanor's history, the more room 4's strange temperature made sense. Whatever presence lingered in that room was still providing the same service Eleanor had offered in life, using cold to preserve and comfort the dead during their final preparation. I started thinking of the cold in room 4 not as a problem to be solved, but as Eleanor's continuing gift to the people we prepared there. Bodies stored in room 4 always looked more peaceful at their viewings, and families frequently commented on how restful their loved one appeared. One evening in December, I was working alone in room 4, preparing Mr. Garcia, an elderly man who died after a long illness. I'd been in the room for about 30 minutes and was starting to shiver badly, but I wanted to finish the facial restoration work before taking a break to warm up. As I worked, I became aware that the cold air around me felt different, not just cold, but somehow comforting, like a gentle presence surrounding me while I worked. My hands, which had been shaking from the cold, became steady and sure. The detailed work that usually took me an hour was flowing smoothly and naturally. I looked up from my work and saw what appeared to be an elderly woman standing at the foot of the preparation table. She was wearing a heavy wool coat and had the kind, concerned expression of someone checking on a patient. When our eyes met, she nodded approvingly at my work and then simply faded away, like frost melting in sunlight. I wasn't afraid. The presence felt protective and encouraging, like having an experienced mentor watching over my shoulder to make sure I was doing my best work. When I looked back at Mr. Garcia, I realized I'd achieved the most natural, peaceful restoration I'd ever completed. He looked exactly like himself, just sleeping comfortably. After that experience, I started volunteering to work in room 4 whenever we had challenging cases, elderly patients who needed extra care to look their best, or younger people whose families needed to see them looking peaceful despite traumatic circumstances. The cold never bothered me as much once I understood it wasn't something to endure, but something to appreciate. Other staff members began noticing that my work in room 4 was consistently excellent. Michael started assigning me the most difficult cases, knowing that whatever happened in that room helped me perform at my best. I never told him about seeing Eleanor, but I think he understood that room 4 had its own way of teaching people how to honor the dead. Last month, we had a case that tested everything I'd learned about Room 4. A young mother had died in a car accident, leaving behind two small children who needed to say goodbye to their mom. The family requested an open casket service, but the injuries were extensive and would require hours of careful restoration work. I volunteered to prepare her in Room 4, knowing that if Eleanor's presence could help anyone, it would be a young mother who needed to look beautiful for her children's final goodbye. I worked for 6 hours straight in that freezing room, but my hands never shook and my concentration never wavered. The restoration was perfect, not just technically, but emotionally. She looked like herself at her happiest, like a mother sleeping peacefully after a long day of caring for her family. At the funeral, her children were able to say goodbye without trauma, remembering their mother as beautiful and at peace. Room 4 still reads 72 degrees on the thermometer, and it still feels like a freezer to anyone who works there. But I've learned that some cold serves a purpose, preserving not just bodies, but dignity, memory, and the love that families need to carry forward after saying goodbye. Eleanor Whitman is still there in Room 4, still offering her gift of peaceful cold to help people transition with comfort and grace. I'm honored to work alongside her, to learn from her patience and skill, and to help families find peace in the knowledge that their loved ones were cared for by hands guided by decades of compassion. Some rooms hold memories, and some rooms hold skills that transcend the people who first practiced them. Room 4 holds both, wrapped in the kind of cold that preserves everything beautiful about the human spirit. Some services begin before the mourners arrive and continue long after they leave. My name is Beth Martinez, and I'm the funeral coordinator at Sacred Heart Memorial Chapel. I've been organizing funeral services for 12 years, handling everything from initial family consultations to final cemetery arrangements. It's detail work that requires sensitivity and precision. Families trust me to create meaningful ceremonies that honor their loved one's memory and provide comfort during the most difficult time of their lives. Sacred Heart is a beautiful facility that's been serving our community since 1938. The main chapel has dark wood pews that seat 200 people, stained glass windows that cast colorful light across the altar, and a pipe organ that fills the space with rich, solemn music. The building was originally constructed as a non-denominational chapel, designed to accommodate families of all faiths and backgrounds. Most of my work happens during normal business hours, but I often stay late to set up for morning services. Funeral preparation is detailed arranging flowers, testing sound systems, positioning the casket, setting up memorial displays, and making sure every element of the service flows smoothly. Families shouldn't have to worry about logistics during their time of grief, so I handle those details in advance. The phantom services started 6 months ago, though it took me several weeks to realize what I was hearing wasn't coming from our chapel. I was setting up for a Thursday morning service, working alone in the main chapel around 9 p.m. The deceased was Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher who'd requested a simple ceremony with readings from his favorite poetry books. I was arranging the memorial flowers when I heard organ music beginning in the chapel. The melody was familiar, Amazing Grace, played with the slow, reverent tempo we use for funeral processionals. I assumed our organist, Mrs. Dalton, had come into practice for the next day's service, though it was unusual for her to work so late. I continued arranging flowers while the music played, but after a few minutes, I heard other sounds joining the organ. Soft voices singing along with the hymn, the quiet rustle of people settling into pews, and the muffled sobs that are inevitable at funeral services. It sounded like a full congregation had gathered in the chapel. I walked toward the main chapel doors to see if Mrs. Dalton needed any assistance with the sound system. But when I looked inside, the chapel was empty. The lights were dimmed to their evening setting, the pews were vacant, and there was no one at the organ. But I could still hear the music and voices clearly, as if a full service was taking place in the same space I was looking at. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, listening to what sounded like a complete funeral service. I heard readings though I couldn't make out the specific words and what sounded like a eulogy delivered by someone with a deep, comforting voice. The congregation responded appropriately, with murmured amens and periods of respectful silence. The service concluded with a final hymn and the sound of people quietly filing out of the chapel. As the last notes of music faded, the chapel returned to its normal evening silence. I walked inside and checked the organ, but it was turned off and locked, just as Mrs. Dalton always left it. I convinced myself I'd been hearing sounds from outside, perhaps a church service from one of the other houses of worship in our neighborhood. Sound can carry strangely in the evening, especially between old buildings with similar acoustics. But the next week, while setting up for another service, I heard it again. Same time, around 9 p.m. Same sounds of a full funeral service taking place in an empty chapel. This time I paid closer attention to the details, and I realized the phantom service was following the exact format we use at Sacred Heart. Opening hymn, readings, eulogy, closing hymn, and recessional. I started making notes about the phantom services. They occurred every 2 or 3 weeks, always during my evening setup time, always following our standard service format. The organ music was always recognizable hymns from our funeral repertoire, and the congregation sounds were exactly what you'd expect, people grieving together in a sacred space. After the fourth occurrence, I decided to investigate more systematically. I brought a digital recorder to capture the phantom service, thinking I could analyze the audio to determine where the sounds were actually coming from. The recording was 2 hours of silence, broken only by the sounds of me moving around the chapel, setting up flowers and testing equipment. Whatever I was hearing wasn't being captured by the microphone, even though it was clear and distinct to my ears. I checked with Mrs. Dalton to see if she'd been practicing in the chapel during evening hours, but she confirmed she only worked during the day and always locked the organ when she finished. I asked our night security guard if he'd heard any unusual sounds from the chapel, but he said the building was always quiet during his rounds. The phantom services continued throughout the fall and winter. I began to recognize the pattern. They always began with Amazing Grace, included 3 readings and a eulogy, and concluded with How Great Thou Art. The timing was consistent, about 45 minutes from opening hymn to final recessional. One evening in January, I decided to participate in the phantom service instead of just listening to it. When the opening hymn began, I sat in one of the back pews and tried to follow along, singing Amazing Grace with the voices I couldn't see. The experience was surprisingly comforting. Even though I was alone in the chapel, I felt surrounded by a congregation of people united in grief and hope. The readings were delivered with genuine emotion, and the eulogy spoke about someone who had lived a life of service and kindness. When the service concluded, I felt the same sense of peaceful closure that families experience after a well-conducted funeral. I started attending the phantom services regularly, always sitting in the back pew and participating quietly. It became a form of meditation for me, a way to reflect on the importance of the work I do and the comfort that funeral services provide to grieving families. During one phantom service in March, I heard something that made me pay closer attention to the eulogy. The speaker mentioned specific details about the deceased, a woman named Catherine, who had been a nurse for 43 years, who had raised 5 children as a single mother, and who had volunteered at Sacred Heart Memorial Chapel for over 20 years. After the service ended, I searched our chapel records for any mention of Catherine. I found her in our volunteer logs from the 1970s and 80s. Catherine Morrison, a registered nurse who had helped coordinate funeral services for families who couldn't afford professional assistance. She had organized flowers, assisted with funeral arrangements, and provided emotional support to grieving families. Catherine had died in 1989, but according to our records, no funeral service had been held for her at Sacred Heart. She'd been buried after a simple graveside ceremony at the request of her family, who wanted to keep costs minimal. I realized I'd been hearing Catherine's funeral service, the service she should have had at Sacred Heart, the service she deserved after 20 years of helping other families honor their loved ones. The phantom congregation was made up of all the people she'd helped over the years, gathering to finally give her the farewell she'd never received. I started leaving the guest book open during the phantom services, curious to see if anything would appear in it. After each service, I would find one new signature, always the same handwriting, always the same name, Catherine Morrison, grateful for the service. The phantom services have become a regular part of my evening routine at Sacred Heart. When I hear the opening notes of Amazing Grace during my setup work, I stop what I'm doing and attend Catherine's service with the invisible congregation that gathers to honor her memory. Last month, I arranged for a memorial plaque to be installed in the chapel, recognizing Catherine Morrison's 20 years of volunteer service. The plaque reads, "In gratitude for her dedication to helping families find comfort in their time of sorrow." The phantom services stopped after the plaque was installed. The chapel remains peaceful during my evening setup time, and the guest book stays empty except for signatures from actual funeral attendees. But sometimes, when I'm arranging flowers or testing the sound system, I hear a single, soft voice humming Amazing Grace in the empty chapel. It's a gentle sound, full of gratitude and peace, reminding me that some services transcend the boundaries of time and space. Catherine Morrison finally received the funeral she deserved, attended by everyone whose lives she'd touched through her years of compassionate service. Some ceremonies take decades to complete, and some congregations gather across the veil between life and death to honor those who spent their lives honoring others. I'm grateful to have been present for Catherine's long-delayed farewell, and I'm honored to continue the work she started, helping families find comfort, dignity, and peace in their darkest moments. 29 years of counting headstones, and the math has never been right. My name is Frank, and I'm the head groundskeeper at Willowdale Cemetery. I've been maintaining these grounds since 1994, responsible for everything from mowing grass to coordinating new burial plots. Willowdale covers 43 acres of gently sloping hills dotted with century-old maple trees, serving families since 1891. According to our official records, we have 847 occupied burial plots. But every month when I do my headstone count, I find 848 graves. The discrepancy started about 5 years ago, though it took me several counts to realize the pattern. As head groundskeeper, part of my job is maintaining accurate records of all graves, monuments, and burial sites. This includes a monthly walkthrough, where I physically count every headstone and cross-reference it with our official burial database. It's detailed work, but necessary. Families depend on us to know exactly where their loved ones are buried. Our cemetery map shows 847 occupied plots, clearly marked with plot numbers, burial dates, and family names. The map is updated monthly by our administrative staff and matches perfectly with our computer database. I've checked it dozens of times, counted the entries multiple ways, and the number is always the same, 847. But when I walk the grounds and count the actual headstones, I always find one extra grave. The first time I noticed the discrepancy, I assumed I'd made a counting error. Willowdale is large enough that it's easy to lose track, especially in the older sections where trees and monuments can obscure your view. I recounted the entire cemetery section by section, using my official map to mark off each grave as I found it. 848 headstones, one more than our records showed. I spent the rest of that day trying to identify which grave wasn't in our database. I walked every section again, checking each headstone against our burial records. Every grave I found was properly documented, correct names, correct dates, correct plot numbers. But somehow, the total count was still one too high. The next month, same thing. 848 headstones, but every individual grave matched our records perfectly. I started thinking maybe there was an unmarked grave I was missing, or perhaps an old burial from before our modern record-keeping system. By the third month, I realized something even stranger was happening. The extra grave wasn't just undocumented, it was moving. I began keeping detailed notes about my monthly counts, marking which sections contained how many graves. Section A had 43 graves, Section B had 57, and so on. But the location of the extra grave would shift from month to month. One month, Section C would have one more headstone than my map indicated. The next month, Section C would match perfectly, but Section F would have an extra grave. The moving grave was never obviously out of place. It always appeared to belong exactly where it was, nestled naturally between other headstones with appropriate spacing and similar styling. The name and dates would be consistent with the time period when that section was developed. The weathering and moss growth would match the surrounding monuments perfectly. But when I checked our burial records, there would be no documentation for that particular grave. No burial permit, no plot purchase, no family contact information. It simply existed where it shouldn't, complete with a backstory that our database had never recorded. I started photographing the extra grave each month, thinking maybe I could track some kind of pattern. The photos showed different graves in different locations, sometimes an elaborate Victorian monument in the historic section, sometimes a simple modern headstone in the newer areas. Always perfectly ordinary-looking graves that happened to exist outside our official records. What disturbed me most was that the extra grave never appeared in the same location twice. If I found an undocumented headstone in Section C one month, it would be gone the next month, replaced by a documented grave that belonged there according to our records. Meanwhile, the extra grave would appear somewhere completely different, as if it had physically moved overnight. I decided to involve Sarah, our cemetery administrator, thinking maybe there were gaps in our database or old records that hadn't been properly digitized. Sarah has worked at Willowdale for 12 years and knows our filing system better than anyone. "Frank, that's impossible," she said when I explained the situation. "Our records are complete, going back to 1891. Every burial is documented. Every plot is accounted for. We've never had a discrepancy." She agreed to help me with the next monthly count, thinking that two people checking the numbers would eliminate any possibility of error. We spent an entire day walking the cemetery together, counting headstones and cross-referencing them with our official map. 848 graves. Sarah counted 848 as well. We spent another day trying to identify which grave wasn't in our records. Just like my solo efforts, every individual headstone we found was properly documented in our database. But the total count was still one too high. "There has to be an explanation," Sarah said, but she looked genuinely puzzled. "Maybe there's an old grave that got documented twice, or a recording error somewhere." We spent the next week going through every piece of paperwork in our files, burial permits, plot deeds, transfer documents, anything that might explain an extra grave. Everything matched perfectly. 847 documented burials, 847 entries in our database, 847 graves on our official map, but 848 headstones on the actual grounds. The mystery became even more complex when I started paying attention to families visiting the extra grave. Every month, when I located the undocumented headstone, I would observe it periodically to see if anyone came to pay respect. People did visit the extra grave. Elderly relatives bringing flowers, middle-aged children cleaning the headstone, grandchildren learning family history. They treated it exactly like any other grave, with the familiarity and reverence that comes from decades of regular visits. I approached a few of these visitors, thinking they might provide clues about the grave's history. Without exception, they were surprised when I suggested the burial might not be properly documented. "Of course, grandmother's grave is in your records," one woman told me. "We've been visiting her here for 15 years. We bought the plot through your office, arranged the headstone through your recommended vendor. Everything was completely legitimate." When I checked our database later, I found complete documentation for her grandmother's burial. Plot number, burial date, headstone specifications, everything the family described was recorded properly. But that was the month when the extra grave appeared in a completely different section of the cemetery. I started to suspect that the extra grave wasn't really extra at all. It was somehow a manifestation of all 847 documented graves, appearing in different forms but representing the same collective presence of everyone buried at Willowdale. This theory was strengthened when I noticed that the extra grave always reflected the character of whatever section it appeared in. In the historic section, it would be an elaborate Victorian monument with ornate carving and poetic inscriptions. In the military section, it would be a simple white headstone with appropriate service emblems. In the children's area, it would be a small marker with gentle imagery and tender words. The extra grave wasn't an unauthorized burial or a record-keeping error. It was something else entirely, a representation of the collective memory of everyone who rested at Willowdale, taking different forms but always maintaining the dignity and respect that every grave deserved. I stopped trying to identify which specific grave was the extra one. Instead, I began to think of the monthly counting discrepancy as a reminder that cemeteries hold more than just individual burials. They hold the combined weight of all the lives, all the memories, all the love that families have invested in these sacred spaces. The moving grave became a source of comfort rather than confusion. Each month, I would find it in its new location and take a few minutes to appreciate the craftsmanship of the headstone, the thoughtfulness of the inscription, and the obvious care that someone had taken to create a beautiful memorial. Last month, I found the extra grave in Section L, a simple granite headstone with elegant lettering that read, "In memory of all who rest here and all who remember them." There was no name, no dates, just that single inscription that seemed to capture the purpose of every cemetery. I checked our records, and of course there was no documentation for such a grave. But when I returned the next day to photograph it, the headstone had returned to its documented identity. Robert Chen, 1923 to 2001. Beloved father and grandfather. The extra grave had moved on to its next location, carrying with it the reminder that some things can't be counted, or cataloged, or reduced to database entries. Some things exist in the spaces between official records, in the accumulated memory of decades of grief and love and remembrance. I still do my monthly headstone count, and I still find 848 graves every time. But now I look forward to discovering where the extra grave has appeared, what form it's taken, and what message it might have for anyone patient enough to notice that the numbers don't always add up the way we expect. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some discrepancies are more truthful than the official records. 847 documented graves, 848 actual presences, and one groundskeeper who's learned that the most important things we tend can't always be counted. Some final requests take time to be understood, and some messages arrive after the funeral is over. My name is Patricia Wong, and I've been a funeral director at Serenity Memorial Home for 18 years. My work involves coordinating every aspect of funeral services, from initial family meetings to final burial arrangements. It's detail-oriented work that requires sensitivity, organization, and the ability to honor a family's wishes while providing guidance during their most difficult time. Serenity Memorial is a family-owned funeral home that's been serving our community since 1967. We pride ourselves on personalizing each service to reflect the unique life and personality of the deceased. Whether it's displaying a musician's instruments, arranging a veteran's military honors, or accommodating specific cultural traditions, we believe every funeral should tell the story of the person being remembered. Mr. Henry Caldwell was 91 years old when he died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday evening in October. His daughter Margaret contacted us the next morning to arrange a traditional funeral service with a 3-day viewing period. Mr. Caldwell had been a retired librarian who'd spent 43 years working at the county library, and his family wanted the service to reflect his love of books and learning. Margaret provided us with detailed instructions for her father's final appearance. He should be dressed in his favorite navy suit, with the silver tie clip he'd worn to work every day for decades. His hair should be combed the way he'd styled it since the 1950s, parted on the left with a small wave in front. And most importantly, he should be wearing his reading glasses. Dad was never without his glasses, Margaret explained, as we discussed the arrangements. He got his first pair when he was 12 years old, and he wore them every waking hour for 79 years. It wouldn't be right for people to see him without them. The glasses were distinctive, thick black frames from the 1970s that he'd never updated, despite his family's encouragement to try more modern style. They were held together with a small piece of clear tape where one of the arms had cracked, and the lenses were scratched from decades of use. They weren't particularly attractive, but they were unmistakably Mr. Caldwell's. We prepared Mr. Caldwell according to his family's wishes and positioned him in our main viewing room on Thursday evening. He looked dignified and peaceful, dressed in his navy suit with his reading glasses resting naturally on his face. The family had requested that his casket be surrounded by books, volumes of poetry, classic literature, and local history that had been meaningful to him throughout his life. The viewing was scheduled to run from Friday morning through Sunday afternoon, with the funeral service on Monday. This extended viewing period would allow Mr. Caldwell's many friends and former library patrons to pay their respects. At 91, he'd outlived most of his contemporaries, but the library community was large and devoted. Friday morning, I arrived early to open the viewing room and ensure everything was arranged perfectly for the family's arrival. When I checked Mr. Caldwell's appearance, I noticed his reading glasses weren't on his face. They were folded neatly on the edge of the casket, resting precisely where his left hand was positioned. I assumed someone from our overnight staff had accidentally bumped them while cleaning the viewing room. Glasses can slip off during transport or positioning, and it's not unusual to need minor adjustments between the preparation and viewing. I carefully placed the glasses back on Mr. Caldwell's face, ensuring they sat naturally and securely. The Friday viewing went smoothly. Margaret and her family spent several hours in the room, greeting visitors and sharing memories of Mr. Caldwell's life. Many people commented on how natural he looked, how the glasses completed his familiar appearance, and how peaceful he seemed in his final rest. Saturday morning, the glasses were on the casket edge again. This time I was more careful about repositioning them, making sure they were secure and wouldn't slide off easily. I checked with our night custodian to see if he'd noticed anything unusual while cleaning the viewing room, but he said everything had appeared normal when he finished his work around midnight. I positioned the glasses more securely on Mr. Caldwell's face, adjusting the earpieces to ensure they wouldn't move easily. The viewing continued without incident throughout Saturday, with a steady stream of visitors paying their respect. Sunday morning, same thing. The glasses were folded neatly on the casket edge, positioned exactly where they'd been the previous 2 days. By now, I was concerned that we might have a recurring problem with the viewing room's climate control or vibration from the building's HVAC system. I spent extra time securing the glasses, even using a small amount of Morticians wax to help keep them in place. I also made a point of checking the room multiple times throughout the day to see if the glasses stayed in position. They remained on Mr. Caldwell's face all day Sunday. The final viewing session ended at 6 p.m., and I personally verified that the glasses were secure before locking the viewing room for the night. Monday morning, the day of the funeral service, the glasses were on the casket edge again. This time I noticed something that made me stop and reconsider what was happening. The glasses weren't just sitting on the casket edge, they were positioned as if someone had carefully placed them there after removing them. The earpieces were folded symmetrically, the lenses were clean, and they were sitting exactly parallel to the casket's edge. More importantly, there was something tucked inside the folded glasses that hadn't been there before. A small piece of paper, folded to fit precisely within the frame's dimensions. I carefully removed the paper and unfolded it. It was a handwritten note in the same careful script that Mr. Caldwell had used for library catalog cards and book recommendations. The message was simple but clear. I can see just fine now. I stood in the viewing room holding the note, trying to understand how it could have appeared inside Mr. Caldwell's glasses. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I'd seen examples of it on the personal items his family had brought for the memorial display. But Mr. Caldwell had been dead for 4 days, and the glasses case had been empty when we first prepared him for viewing. I called Margaret to ask about the note, thinking perhaps the family had placed it there as part of a private farewell ritual. "No," she said, sounding puzzled. "We didn't leave any notes. What does it say?" When I read her the message, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds exactly like something Dad would say," she finally replied. He always joked that he'd been looking at the world through thick lenses for so long, he wondered what it would be like to see clearly. He used to say that when he got to heaven, the first thing he'd do is take off his glasses and see what he'd been missing. The funeral service proceeded as planned, with Mr. Caldwell wearing his reading glasses one final time. I didn't mention the note to other family members, but I kept it carefully preserved in our client files. Some messages are meant for specific people at specific times. After the service, as we were preparing to close the casket for transport to the cemetery, Margaret approached me privately. "Mrs. Wong," she said, "I want you to know that Dad's glasses stayed on his face throughout the entire service. He looked exactly like himself, exactly like we wanted him to look." I nodded, not mentioning that I'd spent considerable effort making sure the glasses remained secure for the final ceremony. "But I think," Margaret continued, "that Dad would want his glasses to stay here. He spent his whole life helping people find the books they needed, helping them see more clearly through reading and learning. Maybe his glasses should help someone else now." She handed me the reading glasses, which she'd carefully removed before the casket was closed. "Would you consider donating them to someone who needs them? Someone who can't afford glasses but wants to keep reading?" I contacted the county library where Mr. Caldwell had worked, and they were delighted to receive the glasses as part of a vision assistance program for low-income patrons. The librarian who coordinated the program said Mr. Caldwell had actually suggested such a program years earlier, but funding had never been available. The glasses went to Mrs. Rodriguez, an 83-year-old woman who'd been struggling to read since her vision insurance lapsed. When the librarian gave her Mr. Caldwell's glasses, she said they fit perfectly and allowed her to see print more clearly than she had in years. A month later, Mrs. Rodriguez returned to the library with a question about the glasses. She'd been reading comfortably with them for weeks, but occasionally she would find small notes tucked inside the frames. Handwritten recommendations for books she might enjoy, suggestions for authors she hadn't discovered, gentle encouragement to explore new subjects. The librarian checked the glasses case and found a note that read, "Try the poetry section. Emily Dickinson might surprise you." Mrs. Rodriguez followed the suggestion and discovered a love for poetry that enriched her remaining years. She would often tell people that Mr. Caldwell's glasses didn't just help her see the words on the page, they helped her see new worlds of beauty and meaning she'd never explored before. The note I found in Mr. Caldwell's glasses case remains in our files, a reminder that some final requests take time to be understood, and some gifts continue giving long after the funeral is over. Mr. Caldwell had spent his life helping people see more clearly through reading, and even in death, he found a way to continue that service. I still think about those 3 mornings when I found his glasses neatly folded on the casket edge, and I understand now that he was trying to tell us something important. He could see just fine, not just in whatever realm he'd entered, but in this world, where his glasses would continue helping others discover the joy of clear vision and good books. Some legacies are measured in buildings or monuments, and some are measured in the simple act of helping someone else see the world a little more clearly. Mr. Caldwell's glasses are still helping people read, still opening new worlds of knowledge and beauty, still carrying forward the spirit of a man who believed that clear vision, literal and metaphorical, was one of life's greatest gifts. Some vigils continue long after visiting hours end, and some comfort arrives when no one is watching. My name is Miguel, and I'm the night custodian at Peaceful Transitions Funeral Home. I've been working the overnight shift for 7 years, arriving at 11 p.m. and finishing at 7 a.m. when the day staff takes over. Most people think working alone in a funeral home at night would be frightening, but it's actually quite peaceful. The building is quiet, the work is routine, and I take pride in making sure everything is clean and ready for families when they arrive in the morning. Peaceful Transitions serves families throughout our county, offering both traditional and contemporary funeral services. We have 3 viewing rooms, a main chapel, administrative offices, and preparation areas in the back. The building was constructed in 1989, designed specifically as a funeral home with modern amenities and a warm, comfortable atmosphere that helps families feel at ease during difficult times. My responsibilities include general cleaning, restocking supplies, minor maintenance tasks, and monitoring our security system. The security setup is comprehensive motion detectors in every room, cameras covering all common areas, and door sensors that alert me if anyone enters the building after hours. It's a good system that's prevented several attempted break-ins over the years. The motion alerts started about 6 months ago, always coming from the viewing rooms where we had active services scheduled for the next day. The first time it happened, I was mopping the main hallway around 2 a.m. when my security monitor chimed with a motion detection alert from viewing room A. We had Mr. Patterson laid out there for a service scheduled the following afternoon, and families sometimes forgot personal items that they needed to retrieve during evening hours. I checked the camera feed for viewing room A, expecting to see a family member who'd entered quietly to avoid disturbing anyone. Instead, I saw an empty room with rows of chairs arranged for the next day's service. The casket was positioned at the front of the room, surrounded by flower arrangements, but there were no people visible anywhere. I walked down to investigate in person, thinking maybe the motion detector was malfunctioning or had been triggered by the building's heating system cycling on. When I entered viewing room A, everything appeared normal. The chairs were arranged properly, the flowers looked fresh, and Mr. Patterson appeared exactly as he had when I checked the room earlier in my shift. But as I was leaving, I noticed that several of the chairs in the front row were rocking slightly, as if someone had just stood up from them. The movement was subtle, just a gentle back and forth motion that gradually slowed to stillness. The chairs were the type with curved rockers designed to provide comfort during long services, and they moved easily when disturbed. I checked the room's vents to see if air circulation might be causing the movement, but the airflow was minimal and directed away from the seating area. I also looked for signs that someone had been in the room: footprints, personal items, anything that might indicate a family member had visited quietly and left. Nothing. The next week, same thing. Motion alert from viewing room B around 2:30 a.m. Camera showing an empty room with gently rocking chairs. This time I responded immediately, reaching the viewing room within 2 minutes of the alert. Again, I found no one there, but several chairs in different parts of the room were moving slightly, as if an invisible congregation had just settled in for a vigil. Over the following months, the pattern became regular and predictable. Every night when we had someone laid out for viewing, the motion detectors would trigger around 2 or 3 a.m. The cameras would show empty rooms with chairs rocking gently, as if people had just sat down or stood up. When I investigated in person, I would find no sign of actual visitors, but the chairs would be moving in patterns that suggested multiple people had been sitting in them. I started paying closer attention to which chairs were moving and how they were positioned. The motion wasn't random chairs in the front rows would rock more than those in the back, and chairs positioned where family members typically sat showed more movement than those usually occupied by friends or acquaintances. It was as if invisible mourners were gathering to keep vigil with the deceased, sitting where living visitors would sit during the actual service. The strange thing was that families began commenting on how peaceful their loved ones looked in the mornings. Not just the standard compliments that families give to funeral directors, but genuine surprise at how serene and comforted their relatives appeared. "Dad looks so much more relaxed than he did yesterday," Mrs. Chen said when she arrived for her father's second day of viewing. "It's like someone was sitting with him all night, keeping him company." I started checking the deceased each morning after the overnight motion alerts, and families were right. There was something different about their appearance, not physically, but in their overall presence. They looked more peaceful, more settled, as if they'd been comforted during the night hours when the building was supposed to be empty. Mr. Rodriguez, whose wife was laid out in viewing room C, noticed the change immediately when he arrived for the morning viewing. "She looks like she did when she was sleeping peacefully at home," he told me. "Last night when we left, she still had that worried expression she'd worn during her illness. But this morning, she looks content, like she knows everything's going to be all right." I decided to stay in one of the viewing rooms during the overnight hours to see if I could observe what was happening during the motion alerts. I positioned myself in the back corner of viewing room A, where Mrs. Williams was laid out for a service the next day. Around 2:15 a.m., the room's atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, but subtly. The air felt warmer and more welcoming, like the difference between an empty house and one filled with family. I heard the soft sounds that you associate with people settling into chairs. Fabric rustling, the quiet creaks of wood adjusting to weight, the gentle sighs that people make when they sit down to rest. I couldn't see anyone, but I could sense their presence. The chairs around me began rocking gently, and I had the distinct impression that I was surrounded by people who had come to keep vigil with Mrs. Williams. Not threatening or disturbing presences, but comforting ones, friends, family members, perhaps other souls who understood the importance of not letting someone face the night alone. I sat quietly for about an hour, and the presence gradually faded. The chairs slowed their rocking and returned to stillness. The air temperature returned to normal, and the room felt empty again. But when I looked at Mrs. Williams, she appeared more peaceful than she had earlier in the evening, as if she'd been surrounded by love and care during those dark hours. I never mentioned my experience to the day staff or to families, but I began to appreciate the overnight vigils as an important part of the services we provided. Not just the official ceremonies with music and eulogies, but the quiet companionship that ensured no one had to spend their final nights alone. The motion alerts became something I looked forward to rather than something that concerned me. When the security system chimed with activity from a viewing room, I knew that caring presences were gathering to provide comfort and companionship to the deceased. I would check the cameras to confirm the gentle chair movements, then continue with my work, knowing that something beautiful was happening in the rooms under my care. Different viewing rooms had different patterns of visitation. Some nights, only a few chairs would rock, suggesting intimate gatherings of close family. Other nights, chairs throughout the room would move, indicating larger groups of people who wanted to pay their respects. The longest vigils seemed to occur for people who had died young or unexpectedly, as if extra comfort was needed for those whose deaths had been particularly difficult for the living to accept. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died suddenly of a heart attack at age 54, noticed the change in his appearance after the first night of viewing. "He looks so much calmer," she said. "Yesterday, he still looked shocked, like he couldn't believe what had happened to him. But today he looks ready, like he's accepted where he is and knows he's going to be all right." I realized that the overnight vigils weren't just providing comfort to the deceased, they were helping families process their grief by showing them that their loved ones were being cared for even when they couldn't be present themselves. Last month, we had a particularly difficult case. A young mother had died in a car accident, leaving behind 2 small children and a devastated husband. The family requested a 3-day viewing, hoping that the extended time would help the children gradually accept what had happened. Each night, the motion alerts from her viewing room were more extensive than usual. Chairs throughout the room would rock for hours, and when I checked on her in the morning, she looked increasingly peaceful and maternal, as if she was being prepared to help her family say goodbye. On the final morning before her funeral, her husband brought the children for a private viewing. The 6-year-old son looked at his mother for a long moment, then turned to his father. "Mommy looks happy now," he said, "like she's not scared anymore." His father agreed, and I saw the relief in his eyes. Whatever comfort the overnight vigils provided to the deceased, they also gave families permission to believe that death wasn't the end of love or care, and that their loved ones were being watched over even when they couldn't be there themselves. I continue to work the night shift at Peaceful Transitions, and the motion alerts continue to signal the presence of invisible mourners keeping vigil with the deceased. I no longer investigate these alerts as security concerns. I simply note them as confirmation that our building serves as more than just a place for daytime ceremonies. Some comfort can't be scheduled or organized or included in funeral service packages. Some vigils happen in the quiet hours when grief and love gather naturally around those who are making the transition from this life to whatever comes next. I'm honored to be the guardian of these overnight gatherings, ensuring that the building remains safe and peaceful for both the living and the dead who find solace in its rooms. Some restoration work happens when no one is watching, and some beauty transcends what makeup can achieve. My name is Linda, and I'm a cosmetologist specializing in postmortem restoration at Eternal Rest Funeral Home. I've been doing this work for 11 years, helping families see their loved ones looking natural and peaceful for final viewings. It's delicate work that requires both technical skill and artistic sensitivity. The goal is never to make someone look artificial or dramatically different, but to restore the appearance they had when they were healthy and at their best. Eternal Rest has been serving our community since 1973, and I've been part of their team since 2012. My work involves everything from basic makeup application to complex facial reconstruction after accidents or illness. Each case requires individual attention and often multiple sessions to achieve the natural, dignified appearance that families need to see during their time of grief. The restoration process typically takes several hours, depending on the complexity of the case. I work closely with our embalming staff to ensure that the deceased is properly prepared before I begin the cosmetic work. Then I apply makeup, style hair, and make any necessary adjustments to create the appearance that families have requested. It's both science and art, requiring knowledge of anatomy, color theory, and the subtle techniques that can make the difference between looking natural and looking obviously made up. Most of my clients are elderly people who died after long illnesses or extended hospital stays. Age and sickness can change someone's appearance significantly, and my job is to help them look more like themselves, to restore the vitality and dignity that illness may have taken away. Families often bring photographs from happier times, asking me to recreate the way their loved one looked 5 or 10 years earlier, before age and sickness took their toll. About 8 months ago, I started noticing that some of my restoration work was being improved overnight by someone else. The first time it happened, I was working on Mrs. Chen, an 87-year-old woman who had requested that she look like herself at 70, according to her daughter. Mrs. Chen had deep laugh lines around her eyes, pronounced wrinkles across her forehead, and the kind of age spots that develop after decades of sun exposure. Her daughter provided several photographs from her 70th birthday party, showing a woman who looked vibrant and happy despite the signs of aging. I spent 3 hours working on Mrs. Chen's restoration, using specialized makeup techniques to minimize her wrinkles and age spots while maintaining her natural appearance. When I finished, she looked good, not dramatically younger, but softer and more comfortable, like someone who had aged gracefully and peacefully. The next morning, when I arrived to do final touch-ups before the viewing, Mrs. Chen looked different. Not obviously different, but subtly transformed. The laugh lines around her eyes had softened significantly. Her forehead wrinkles were barely visible, and her age spots had faded to the point where they required much less concealer. She looked exactly like the photographs her daughter had shown me, vibrant, dignified, and decades younger than her 87 years. I assumed that our climate control system had affected my makeup work, causing it to settle or blend differently overnight. Humidity and temperature changes can sometimes improve makeup application, making it look more natural after several hours. I made note of the improvement and continued with the final preparations. Mrs. Chen's daughter was thrilled with how her mother looked. "That's exactly her," she said, tears in her eyes. "That's Mom the way I want to remember her, beautiful and confident and happy." 2 weeks later, I had a similar experience with Mr. Rodriguez, a 93-year-old man whose family wanted him to look like he did in his prime. Mr. Rodriguez had been a handsome man, but advanced age had left him with deep facial furrows, prominent age spots, and the kind of skin deterioration that comes with nearly a century of living. I worked carefully to minimize his age-related changes while preserving his essential appearance. When I finished, he looked dignified and peaceful, though clearly elderly. The next morning, his age lines had softened dramatically. His skin tone was more even, and he appeared to be in his early 70s rather than his 90s. By the third occurrence, I realized that something beyond normal makeup settling was happening overnight in our restoration room. I started taking detailed before and after photographs of my work, thinking that documenting the changes might help me understand what was causing them. The photos confirmed what I was observing: significant improvement in the apparent age and vitality of elderly clients between the evening when I finished my work and the morning when families arrived for viewings. The changes weren't random or haphazard. They were consistently improvements that made clients look healthier, younger, and more vibrant, without making them look artificial or obviously altered. Wrinkles would soften, age spots would fade, and skin tone would improve in ways that enhanced rather than contradicted my original restoration work. I decided to stay late one evening to see if I could observe what was happening in the restoration room after hours. I positioned myself where I could see Mr. Williams, an 81-year-old man I'd prepared that afternoon, without being obvious about my surveillance. Around midnight, the atmosphere in the restoration room changed subtly. The air felt warmer and more gentle, like being wrapped in a soft blanket. I couldn't see anyone, but I had the distinct sense that someone else was present in the room with me. I watched Mr. Williams carefully, and over the course of about 2 hours, I could see gradual changes happening to his appearance. His deep forehead line seemed to relax and soften. The age spots on his hands and face became less prominent. His overall complexion improved, taking on a healthier tone that suggested vitality rather than the pallor of advanced age. The changes happened so slowly that they were almost imperceptible in real time. But by 2 a.m., Mr. Williams looked 20 years younger than he had when I'd finished my work 6 hours earlier. More importantly, he looked like himself at his best, not artificially young, but restored to the appearance he'd had when he was healthy and confident. I never saw who or what was making these improvements, but I felt a presence of incredible gentleness and skill. Whoever was working on my clients overnight had an artistic eye and a deep understanding of how to restore someone's essential beauty without making them look false or overdone. The next morning, Mr. Williams' family was amazed by how good he looked. "That's Dad exactly the way I remember him," his son said. "You've captured him perfectly confident and handsome and ready for anything." I began leaving detailed notes about each client's restoration goals, thinking that whoever was making the overnight improvements might benefit from understanding what the family had requested. I would write things like, "Family wants her to look like she did for her 60th birthday," or "reduce appearance of illness, emphasize his natural dignity." The overnight improvements became more targeted and effective after I started leaving these notes. Clients would wake up looking exactly like the photographs their families had provided, as if someone with incredible skill had spent hours perfecting every detail of their appearance. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died after a long battle with cancer, brought me a photograph from their 40th wedding anniversary. "He was so handsome that day," she said. "The cancer took so much from him, but I want people to remember him like this, strong and happy and full of life." I did my best to recreate the appearance from the photograph, but the effects of his illness were extensive. When I finished, he looked better than he had in months, but still showed obvious signs of what he'd been through. The next morning, he looked exactly like the anniversary photograph. The restoration was flawless. He appeared healthy, confident, and genuinely happy, as if the cancer had never touched him. His wife took one look at him and burst into tears of joy. "That's my husband," she said. That's the man I fell in love with. The man I want to remember forever. I started researching the history of our restoration room, wondering if there might be some explanation for the overnight improvements. I learned that Eternal Rest had been founded by Margaret Sullivan, a former Hollywood makeup artist who had specialized in making aging actors look younger for film roles. Margaret had died in 1998, but she had continued working almost until the end of her life. According to the staff who remembered her, she had been obsessed with perfecting techniques for age reduction and restoration. She believed that everyone deserved to be remembered at their most beautiful, and she had spent decades developing methods to achieve natural-looking youth enhancement. Margaret's office had been converted into our current restoration room after her death. Her makeup collection, her reference books, and even some of her specialized tools were still stored in the cabinets around the room. I began thinking of the overnight improvements as Margaret's continued work, her dedication to helping people look their absolute best during their final appearances. The changes were always consistent with her philosophy: natural, dignified, and focused on revealing each person's essential beauty rather than creating artificial effects. The collaboration between my daytime work and the overnight improvements became seamless and effective. I would do the foundational restoration work, establishing the basic appearance and addressing any obvious damage or deterioration. Then Margaret, or whoever was making the overnight changes, would refine and perfect the restoration, bringing out details and subtleties that elevated my work to a level I couldn't achieve on my own. Families began requesting our services specifically because of the quality of our restoration work. Word spread that Eternal Rest could make people look exactly like themselves at their best, and we started receiving clients from other counties who wanted their loved ones to have the benefit of our apparently superior techniques. I never told anyone about the overnight improvements, but I began leaving small thank you notes along with my client information. Thank you for your help with Mrs. Chen. Her family was so happy. Or, Mr. Rodriguez looked perfect. I couldn't have achieved that level of detail on my own. The notes would always be gone by morning, but the quality of the overnight work seemed to improve even further, as if whoever was helping me appreciated being acknowledged and encouraged. Last month, I had my most challenging case yet. A young woman had died in a car accident, and her injuries were extensive. Her family desperately wanted an open casket service, but the damage was severe enough that I wasn't sure it would be possible to restore her to a viewable condition. I worked for 6 hours, using every technique I'd learned to rebuild and restore her facial features. When I finished, she looked peaceful and dignified, but clearly showed signs of trauma. I left a detailed note explaining the family's request and asking for whatever help could be provided. The next morning, she looked absolutely beautiful. Not just restored, but radiant, like a young woman sleeping peacefully, with a slight smile on her face. The restoration was so perfect that her family was able to say goodbye without any trace of the trauma that had taken her life. Her mother held my hand after the service and said, "Thank you for giving me back my daughter. She looks exactly like herself, beautiful and happy and ready for whatever comes next." I continue to work at Eternal Rest, collaborating each day with skills and artistry that transcend what any single person could achieve. My clients consistently look their absolute best, restored not just to health and youth, but to the essential beauty that reflects their spirit and character. Some restoration work requires more than makeup and technique. Some beauty emerges when love and skill combine across the boundaries between life and death, creating results that comfort families and honor the memory of those who have passed. I'm grateful to be part of this collaboration, helping people transition to their final rest, looking exactly the way they should be remembered, beautiful, dignified, and eternally themselves. Some journeys begin before the final destination is reached, and some preparations happen in the quiet hours before dawn. My name is Dale, and I'm the crematorium operator at Serenity Memorial Services. I've been working in this specialized field for 14 years, responsible for the respectful and dignified cremation of those whose families have chosen this method of final disposition. It's solemn work that requires technical expertise, attention to detail, and deep respect for both the deceased and their families' wishes. Serenity Memorial is a full-service facility that handles everything from initial funeral arrangements to final cremation and memorial services. Our crematorium is located in a separate wing of the building, accessible through a long hallway that connects it to the main funeral home. This design provides families with privacy during services, while maintaining the operational separation that state regulations require. The crematorium facility includes a preparation area where I receive and verify the deceased, the cremation chamber itself, and a processing room where cremated remains are prepared for return to families. I typically begin work at 6 a.m., reviewing the day's schedule and ensuring that all equipment is properly calibrated and ready for operation. Each cremation is handled individually, with careful documentation and verification procedures to ensure that families receive the correct remains. My work involves more than just operating equipment. I coordinate with funeral directors to receive the deceased, verify identification and cremation authorization paperwork, and ensure that each person is treated with dignity throughout the entire process. Families trust us with their most precious responsibility, and I take that trust seriously every single day. About 10 months ago, I started noticing something unusual about our facility's motion detection system during the overnight hours. Serenity Memorial has a comprehensive security system with motion sensors throughout the building. The sensors are positioned strategically to detect any unauthorized entry or movement after business hours. Each sensor is numbered and mapped, so when one triggers, we know exactly which area of the building is experiencing activity. The motion alerts always follow the same pattern. Sensors trigger in sequence from the main funeral home toward the crematorium, as if someone is walking the entire length of the connecting hallway. Sensor 12 in the main lobby, then sensor 15 near the administrative offices, then sensors 18, 21, and 24, as the path continues toward the crematorium wing. The first time it happened, I assumed we had a security breach. Someone had entered the building after hours and was moving toward the crematorium area. I arrived within 15 minutes of the alert, but found no signs of entry or presence anywhere in the facility. All doors were properly locked. Nothing had been disturbed, and the building was completely empty. I reviewed the security camera footage, but the cameras showed empty hallways throughout the time period when the motion sensors were triggering. Whatever was causing the alerts wasn't visible to our surveillance system, but it was substantial enough to activate motion detectors that are calibrated to ignore small animals or environmental factors. The second occurrence happened 3 weeks later, following the exact same pattern. Sensors triggered in sequence from the main building toward the crematorium, suggesting someone walking the full length of the hallway. Again, I found no evidence of actual intrusion when I investigated. By the fourth occurrence, I realized there was a specific pattern to when these phantom walks happened. The motion alerts only occurred on nights when we had someone scheduled for cremation the following day. I began keeping detailed records of the sensor activations and cross-referencing them with our cremation schedule. The correlation was perfect. Every night before a scheduled cremation, the motion sensors would trigger in sequence around 11:30 p.m., suggesting someone making the walk from the main funeral home to the crematorium. The timing never varied. 11:30 p.m. exactly. Sensors 12 through 24 triggering in sequence over a period of about 8 minutes. If we had multiple cremations scheduled for the next day, the phantom walks would repeat once for each person who would be cremated. I started arriving early on mornings after the motion alerts to see if anything in the crematorium area had changed overnight. I never found signs of physical disturbance, but there was always something different about the atmosphere in the preparation room. The air felt warmer and more peaceful, like someone had spent time there ensuring everything was ready for the day's services. More significantly, the deceased who were scheduled for cremation always appeared more peaceful on mornings after the phantom walks. Not physically different, but somehow more settled and prepared. as if they had made their peace with the transition they were about to undergo. Mr. Patterson's daughter noticed the change when she came for a final viewing before his cremation. "Dad looks so calm," she said. "Yesterday, he still seemed anxious, like he wasn't ready to let go. But today he looks peaceful, like he's accepted what's happening and he's ready for whatever comes next." I began thinking of the phantom walks as preparation journeys, opportunities for the deceased to familiarize themselves with the path they would take to their final transition. The motion sensor activations suggested that something was helping them make the journey from the main funeral home to the crematorium before their actual transfer, allowing them to experience the passage in a calm, unhurried way. The idea made sense from both practical and emotional perspectives. Cremation represents a significant transition, and some people might benefit from a gentle introduction to the process, rather than experiencing it for the first time during their actual transfer to the crematorium. I started leaving detailed notes about each person scheduled for cremation, thinking that whoever was making the phantom walks might benefit from understanding their background and personality. I would write things like, "Mr. Chen was a quiet man who appreciated peaceful environments," or "Mrs. Rodriguez loved flowers and found comfort in beautiful surroundings." The notes would be gone by morning, but the peaceful atmosphere in the preparation room seemed to become more pronounced, as if whoever was helping with the preparation journeys was taking individual needs and preferences into account. Dr. Martinez, whose wife was scheduled for cremation, spent extra time with her during the final viewing. "She seems ready," he told me. "I was worried that cremation might frighten her somehow, but she looks completely at peace with the decision. It's like she's already made the journey in her mind and knows she's going to be all right." I realized that the phantom walks weren't just helping the deceased prepare for cremation, they were helping families feel confident that their loved ones were comfortable with the choice that had been made on their behalf. The motion sensor activations became something I looked forward to rather than something that concerned me. When the security system chimed with the familiar sequence of alerts, I knew that gentle preparation was taking place, ensuring that the next day's cremations would be conducted with people who were ready and at peace with their final transition. Different people seemed to require different types of preparation. Some phantom walks took the standard 8 minutes, suggesting a calm, steady journey. Others took longer, with extended pauses at certain sensors, as if someone needed extra time to process each step of the journey. A few walked the route multiple times in one night, perhaps needing additional familiarity with the path before feeling comfortable. Mrs. Chen, who had been anxious about cremation according to her family, had 3 separate phantom walks the night before her scheduled service. Her daughter commented the next morning that her mother looked completely transformed from worried to peaceful. "It's like someone spent the night with her, helping her understand that everything was going to be fine," she said. I began staying late occasionally to see if I could observe anything during the phantom walks. I would position myself in the crematorium preparation room around 11:15 p.m. and wait for the motion alerts to begin. I never saw anyone, but I could sense a presence moving through the facility during the sensor activations. The hallway would feel occupied, as if someone was walking slowly and thoughtfully from the main building toward the crematorium. The presence felt gentle and reassuring, like a guide helping someone navigate an unfamiliar journey. When the presence reached the preparation room where I was waiting, the atmosphere would become extraordinarily peaceful. I would feel surrounded by comfort and acceptance, as if I was in the presence of someone who understood the importance of the work we do and wanted to ensure it was conducted with appropriate care and dignity. Last month, we had a particularly challenging case. A young father had died unexpectedly, and his family was struggling with their decision to choose cremation. They worried that he might be frightened or uncomfortable with the process, and they questioned whether they were making the right choice. The night before his cremation, the phantom walk took over an hour instead of the usual 8 minutes. The motion sensors triggered repeatedly as the presence made multiple journeys between the main building and the crematorium, as if extensive preparation was needed to help this particular person feel ready for his transition. The next morning, when his family came for their final goodbye. His wife was amazed by his appearance. "He looks so peaceful," she said. "Yesterday I was worried we were making the wrong decision, but today I can see that he's ready. He looks like he understands what's happening, and he's comfortable with it." I continue to work at Serenity Memorial, and the Phantom Walks continue to prepare people for their final transition through cremation. The motion sensor activations remind me that my work is part of a larger process of care and preparation that extends beyond business hours and official procedures. Some journeys require guidance, and some transitions benefit from patient preparation. I'm honored to be part of a process that ensures no one faces their final passage alone or unprepared. The Phantom Walks demonstrate that even in death, we can find comfort in taking things one step at a time, with gentle guides helping us navigate paths we've never traveled before. Each morning when I arrive to begin the day's cremations, I know that everyone scheduled for service has been prepared not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually for the transition they're about to undergo. Some preparation happens in quiet halls during peaceful hours, ensuring that when the time comes, the final walk leads to comfort rather than fear, to acceptance rather than resistance, and to peace rather than anxiety about the unknown.